I came home early that day, hoping to surprise my wife, Georgia. But instead, the surprise was on me. There in our bed was my wife, tangled in sheets with my own brother, Brad Jr. My heart stopped. For 3 years, they've been plotting behind my back. Their secret plans, their lies. It was all out in the open. Betrayed by the two people I trusted most, I knew one thing for sure. They would regret crossing me. This isn't just the end of my marriage. It's the beginning of my revenge. It was nearly a mess. The contracts sent to the client were full of mistakes. Wrong amounts, wrong prices, and the layout was just bad. So, when my older brother Brad Jr. asked me to help him fix his mess, I should have known something was off. I told my wife, Georgia, and my family, my dad, Brad Sr., my mom, Hattie, and my older sister, Joanna, that I had to fly out for 3 days to clean up Brad Jr.'s mistakes. I wanted to make sure we didn't lose the contract. When I called the client, they weren't very impressed with what my brother had sent. I knew I had to go meet them to clear things up. If I didn't act fast, our family business would face some tough times ahead. Our family business, Total Build, makes portable homes all over the country. These tiny houses are mobile and cater to several industries. If you've ever stayed in a small house at a caravan park, that's us. We're the people to contact if you want a vacation cabin by the beach or in the Australian outback. My name is Robert Other, but my friends and family call me Robbie. At the start of this story, I was the operations manager for our family business, where everyone worked, even my wife. Well, my wife, Georgia, did until a couple of months ago when she had to stop working because she was 6 months pregnant with our first child. As the operations manager at Total Build, I handled everything from logistics and shipping to resources and hiring people. I also managed finances and sales, making sure our 30 staff knew what to build according to the plans. My parents ran the business, my sister did office work, and my older brother was in sales. Brad was not a very good salesperson, but my parents thought he was great. I never understood why. From the outside, you would see us as a typical family. Mom, Dad, and 3 kids. Sure, we had our fights and disagreements sometimes, but I always felt we were there for each other when it mattered most. I hurried home to pack a bag before catching a flight. I wanted to be ready for a client first thing in the morning. Georgia was sitting on the bed, gently rubbing her baby bump. She wore a thin cotton top that reminded me to stay. Instead of focusing on her, I vented about my brother's latest mistake while I stuffed a carry-on bag for my trip. When I paused to take a breath, she spoke up. "Robbie," she said with a knowing tone, "you know he means well. Brad is great at talking with people. But numbers? That's where he struggles, and you shine." We had this argument many times before. I quickly glanced at her and added more clothes to my suitcase. I sighed. "I understand, Georgia, but I'm tired of cleaning up his mess every time. No one seems to notice how much time I spend traveling to fix things. If I don't remind Joanna of what to do, the teams fall behind. And if I don't check the numbers for Mom or write the messages for Dad, there wouldn't even be a company." I sighed again, feeling overwhelmed. In that moment, I felt like the hardest working person in the family, yet no one seemed to care how I felt. Sure, I earned good money, and I kept track of everything, knowing what everyone made. No one could argue with that. But it felt like I was always on the outside looking in. I was needed, but not truly included in the family's close circle. It was frustrating. I hated being the youngest. Georgia must have noticed how down I was feeling while I packed my shoes. She walked over and wrapped her arm around me. "Robbie, I'm sorry," she said gently. "You're right. You do a lot. But soon we'll have a baby to care for, and your family needs to step up more because you'll be a dad." I smiled at her words and reached to touch her baby bump. "You'll be back in 3 days?" she asked, looking at me with hope. "Yeah, I should be back Friday evening," I replied, pulling my gaze away from her belly to look into her eyes. "I'll take care of Brad's latest problem, then get ready for the next one he will throw my way." I looked at my wife's round belly. "I swear this baby will be easier than managing our family." Feeling a bit defeated in my role as the family worker, I drove from the Gold Coast to Brisbane to catch my flight to Melbourne. I did it so often these days that I had my travel routine down perfectly. First, I read a few chapters of a book during takeoff. Then, I did an hour of work once we were flying smoothly, and after that, I watched a movie until we landed. The next day went quickly. I met with the client team to talk about their quote. They were happy that I came to see them in person. They liked how I presented everything so much that they ordered 15 more units right then, which added almost 40% to the quote. I was thrilled because this extra order would help us reach our financial goal 3 months early. By the time I left on Wednesday afternoon, I was finished 2 days ahead of schedule. I thought about staying in Melbourne for a while. I could enjoy a meal at one of the cozy alley restaurants or have a drink at one of the many unique bars. Melbourne has a lot to offer. But I missed my wife. After thinking about how I had been telling Georgia about Brad and my family issues the night before, I decided it would be nice to go home early. I wanted to support her as she entered the last part of her pregnancy. My phone was nearly out of battery after using it for internet all day, so I called an Uber to the airport. As a frequent flyer, changing my flight was easy. I even decided to upgrade to business class using my reward points for the flight home. I had just a few minutes to spare, but I made it to the gate and was on my way home soon. I felt great as I stepped off the plane. We passed through a storm on the way down, and watching the lightning flash through the clouds was exciting. After landing in Brisbane, I hopped into my utility vehicle, which we call a ute in Australia, for the drive back the Gold Coast. My 3-year-old Ford Ranger might not be the fastest, but it was a company lease like all our family cars. I found my Ranger useful for moving things between job sites often. I didn't mind doing some physical work with the teams. Like all the guys in the other family, I was a strong and solid guy. I believed my ute showed everyone that I treated all parts of the business equally. As I got into the car, I plugged in my phone for the ride home. I tried to call Georgia a couple of times along the way, leaving messages that I would be home soon after catching an early flight. But each time it went straight to voicemail. A little over an hour later, I frowned when I saw I couldn't pull into my driveway. My brother Brad's car was parked where I usually parked mine. I wondered why he was there so late, but I didn't think much about it. I usually trusted him. I parked and grabbed my travel bag from the passenger seat. I walked in through the side door just like I always did. But before I could say hello, I heard a sound that froze me in my tracks. It was a noise that made every husband in my place feel a sinking feeling in their stomach. Standing between the living room and the hallway leading to my bedroom, I listened to the unmistakable sounds of intimacy, along with Georgia's familiar voice. I didn't want to look, but I knew I had to see what was happening. If I didn't, I might not gather the courage to deal with it later. I wasn't sure what I would do, but I knew I needed to know for sure. I took out my phone and set it to record, quietly making my way up the hallway. I thought I was smart to gather proof before confronting anyone. So, with my phone ready, I positioned myself outside the master bedroom in the dark hallway. I thought I could handle what I would see, but I was wrong. Georgia has always been a stunning woman. She has dark brown shoulder-length hair, warm brown eyes, and a sweet button nose. Her smile can brighten any room, and her frown can make it feel chilly. She is tall, just under 6 feet, and she has a slim waist. I always appreciated her figure. When she became pregnant, her body changed, and I found her even more beautiful. But in my eyes, her best feature was her curves. You know how some fit women look great in yoga pants? Georgia doesn't need those to look amazing. Her shape is all natural. As I stood there in the hallway, I caught sight of her. The body I thought was mine alone was not. I held my phone tightly, fighting the rush of emotions inside me. Anger was the strongest feeling, but underneath it there was sadness, a bit of fear, and although I hated to admit it, love. Georgia let out a soft sigh, taking a deep breath as I saw her shiver slightly. "Brad," she said, turning her head away from me, her voice calm but tired. "Robbie can never find out this baby isn't his. It would break him. The next one has to be his." Brad opened his mouth to reply, but I couldn't stand it anymore. Georgia was right about one thing. It felt like my whole world had fallen apart. I was furious about their betrayal, ready to lash out, but I took a deep breath. Hurting anyone wouldn't solve anything. I stepped into the room, my footsteps heavy. They noticed the sound, but I spoke quickly before they could turn around. "Well then," I said, my voice low. "It's a good thing there won't be another baby because I'm done with both of you." There is something awkwardly amusing about people who cheat when they get caught. The quick movements as they scramble to cover themselves are a bit ironic. It's almost funny because the person who was hurt has usually seen at least one of the cheaters without clothes. Brad and Georgia were no different, quickly trying to hide themselves. I paused for a moment, realizing I was the one standing in the doorway talking to them. Their eyes went wide with surprise. Brad finally spoke up. "Robbie, what are you doing here?" "You were supposed to be in Melbourne?" he asked, trying to sound casual as if we were having a relaxed chat. "I was in Melbourne, idiot," I snapped, "and I'm so good at making things work that I finished your mess fast. I thought I'd come home to spend time with my wife to show her some love, but it seems that I'm not needed." "Robbie, it's not—" Georgia started to say softly but stopped, realizing her words wouldn't change anything. "What it looks like," I finished for her, glaring at her. "I understand perfectly. Next you'll say it was just a mistake. Go ahead, disrespect me more. Or maybe you should tell me it was all in my head that my brother was with you in bed." I shot a hard look at both of them. "And I won't even bring up the other details. It seems I wasn't even here when you made this baby. Both of you can just deal with the mess you've created." I stared at them for a moment, my fist clenched. Georgia looked scared, panicking as she pulled the sheet over herself. Brad stared back at me, confused. "I'm leaving now," I said sharply, looking at the two people I once cared for. "I'll be back in a couple of hours to get my things and move out. How long have you known that my brother and wife have been together in my home, in my bed?" "Son, I understand you're upset," my father replied, trying to stay calm. "But this isn't the way to talk to your mother. We taught you better." What surprised me was that instead of sharing my pain, he sounded more disappointed in me. "How long?" I repeated, my voice low and tense. Anger was boiling inside me. My mother looked down at her feet, then to my father and back to me before she sighed. The most shocking part was the lack of regret on either of their faces. My mom showed a hint of shame, but my dad seemed almost proud. 3 years, she said. "We've known since almost the start. If I thought I was hurt by the betrayal before, now I realized I was wrong. They were pushing me even lower." "What the hell?" I shouted. "Now, son, this isn't the way to speak to us. We're your parents," he began. "Just stop, Dad," I interrupted, stressing the word dad. I could feel the neighbors watching from their windows. I didn't care. "You've known your oldest son has been with my wife, your youngest son's wife, for 3 years, and you never said anything to me? What kind of parents are you? Do you even know the baby is my brother's and not mine?" They stood silent, only looking at me. Their silence spoke volumes. My head throbbed. A headache was rising, and my vision started to blur as the whole situation felt unreal. I said nothing and just took deep breaths. If nothing else, martial arts taught me how to stay calm. We all remained quiet for a couple of minutes. I tilted my head, staring at my parents, both of us glaring. "Does Joanna know?" I asked. My mom spoke without thinking. "She caught them during one of your trips. She came to our home and found them together." "I see," I replied. My dad opened his mouth, but I raised my hand to stop him. "No, I understand. I'm just the youngest who trusts everyone, believing it's okay for my family to keep this secret about my brother being with my wife and hiding everything from me. I see it now, because what you all think is right feels so wrong to me." My face twisted in anger. "You clearly don't care about me at all. You must have enjoyed sending me away to fix my brother's mistakes while he was with my wife." "Son, it's not like that." Dad started to explain. "It sure feels like it," I snapped back. He stepped back, realizing how serious I was. Dad knew my martial arts training. In earlier days, he had even supported it. "Robbie, please," my mother begged, glancing at our neighbors' houses. "Come inside. Sit down so we can talk. There must be a way to work this out. A way for you, Brad, and Gregoria to handle this." "Work this out?" I replied sharply. "Can you hear yourself? Let's think about it for a second." I put my hands on my hips and pretended to think, using a silly tone. "Oh, we're sorry for keeping you in the dark for 3 years while your wife and brother were seeing each other. How about we say we're sorry for sending you away so they could be together in your home?" I stopped and looked at them. Then I let out a harsh laugh, waving my hands in mockery. "Wait, I know. How about we say we're sorry we lied to you about how your brother got your wife pregnant? We thought it was fine to let you raise his child without ever telling you." I stopped joking and stared at the woman I had once seen as a caring mother. "No?" I asked, waiting for a response, but none came. "Is this what you wanted, Mom? For me to raise Brad's child without knowing the truth?" I finished. She looked away. I sensed that this was actually what my parents wanted. I stared at her, confused about who these people were. "Listen, son," my dad said. "We understand. We truly do. You are upset, and we want to help. Maybe when you calm down." I interrupted him again. "Calm? There is no calm. Haven't either of you noticed how angry I am at this family? I feel betrayed by everyone. Not only do you not understand why I feel this way, but you also want me to just accept it. No way. And I can't even see a hint of regret for the hurt you're causing me." They went silent, just staring at me as if they were aliens trying to understand human feelings. What went unsaid could fill books. They really thought I should accept this situation even if I didn't agree with it. For the first time since I arrived, I looked away from my parents, feeling my shoulders drop. I thought I saw my mother begin to understand. She stepped toward me. I noticed her movement, and my posture straightened as I whispered firmly, "Why didn't anyone tell me?" I asked, feeling the first hint of plea in my voice. Dad tightened his grip on Mom's arm, stopping her from getting closer to me or answering my question. He looked down at me from the porch, studying me for a moment before deciding to speak. "We've talked about this many times," Dad said, "but every time, we thought it would be better if you didn't know." He spoke as if he were sharing a report, matter of fact and without emotion. Not out of compassion for his child in pain, but out of business interest. My father said, "You were happy not knowing the truth. You were doing a great job at the company, keeping everything running well, and we didn't want to disturb that." "The company?" I asked, tilting my head in confusion. "Yes, son, you are very important to us. If you found out what was really happening, it would create problems everywhere in the company: sales, production, delivery, and quality. Look at you now. I can see this will upset a lot of things and we'll lose our edge. This is why we kept it from you." He spoke like he was reading a script. This time, my mother grabbed my father's arm tightly as he prepared to keep talking about how I should just accept my situation. She noticed the expression on my face. My fists tensed and relaxed as he spoke. My voice dropped lower than ever, sounding rough. "So let me get this straight," I said. "You didn't tell me about the man and the situation because you thought it would hurt the company? You all knew she wasn't having my child, and you thought it was okay to let me live in this lie just to keep things running smoothly." "Robbie," my mother began, but my father cut her off, tightening his grip on her arm. "Yes, son. We thought we were helping everyone, including you," he replied. "Georgia told us the next child would be yours, not your brother's." At that moment, I felt a surge of anger toward my family. Instead of acting on it, I took a breath. I felt like they had all betrayed me for nothing more than business goals. "Well, don't I feel special?" I said sarcastically. "What a loving family I have, keeping me in the dark and making life easy so I wouldn't notice the chaos around me." My father didn't catch the meaning behind my words, but my mother did. "Robbie," she began again, but Dad interrupted. "I'm glad you see it that way, son," he said with a grin, thinking I was calming down and accepting the situation. "All of you can leave me alone." "I quit," I declared, my tone flat. "Yes, son, it's good that you're coming to terms with this. We'll figure it all out." "What?" My father's smile faded as he processed what I had just said. "I said I quit. Right now, this moment, effective immediately. I resign, and you can take your company goals and shove them." I turned and walked away toward the car. "Robbie." My mother tried to speak again, but I turned back, glaring at my parents. "You know what, Mom, Dad? You both knew all this time. Not only did neither of you tell me, but you didn't even try to stop it from happening. You just accepted it and treated me badly without me even knowing. I understand now. You both want to fix things and calm me down. But I should be your son first, employee second. I should be able to come to you when I hurt. I used to think that way until I realized you both are as responsible as the others." I paused and saw their faces. Dad's eyes were narrowing, and Mom was looking shocked. If everyone in this family thinks it's okay to treat me so badly for the past 3 years just for the company, then you're right. Dad, You raised me better. I won't put up with it. So I'm leaving this family. I am no longer your son." I turned away, walked to my car, almost yanking the door off, and grabbed my bag from the back seat. I slammed the door shut and threw the keys to the company truck at their feet. They just stood there. "Take the truck. Don't call me, text me, or try to reach out in any way. Let the rest of the family know, too. Don't expect me at birthdays, Easter, or Christmas. And tell your favorite son, the one who you care about so much more than me, that if he ever sees me on the street, he should run the other way. Because if I see him, I'll be furious." My parents looked shocked. "Get my severance pay ready," I said firmly. "Make sure my bonus is up to today when I fixed Brad's mistakes while he was messing things up for me. If it's not there, you will regret treating me this way." I pulled my laptop out of my bag and tossed it toward them. "There's my work laptop. If it's broken, take it out of my severance. I don't care if it works." My parents stood silently as I took out my personal phone. I noticed all the messages and missed calls from Georgia, but I ignored them. I ordered an Uber. My mother found a bit of courage and tried to speak to me. Her voice was soft and weak. I could tell her nails were digging into Dad's arm. He looked upset about what I had done with the laptop. "Robbie," my mother said, "I know it shouldn't have happened, but it will all work out. We love you." I grabbed the handle of my suitcase and started to walk away down the street toward my ride. I turned back one last time to the woman who used to be my mother. "No, it won't be okay, Hattie," I said, using her name. "None of you really understand what love is. But for me, I loved and trusted my wife and family. Now I see that I was wrong because I thought my family would support me more than anyone else. But tonight, I learned a hard lesson. Love and trust can mean very little. You say you love me. Go ahead and tell that to someone else and see if they believe it after hearing what I shared." I didn't say anything more as I walked away. I met my ride at the end of the street as rain began to fall. When I got into the Uber and stared out the window, it hit me that neither of my parents even tried to follow me. After all the years I had helped them with their business, I felt like a huge letdown to them. I had the Uber drop me off at what used to be my home. At least Brad and Georgia were gone. I started to pack up, putting clothes and personal things into boxes. I loaded them into the old Toyota Camry that I had bought for Georgia a few years ago. We planned to get a new car in a couple of months after the baby was born, but I thought, why bother? I paid for it. Since she wasn't having my baby, I would keep the car. Georgia could keep Brad's baby. I figured I was getting the better deal. I still had some things that wouldn't fit in the car, but whatever was in there would be enough for me for the next few weeks. Before I left the house for good, I took down the big wedding picture in the living room. It was a large photo that Georgia's parents had made for us on our first wedding anniversary. In the picture from our wedding day, Georgia and I stood in the front. To our left were my mom and dad, my brother and sister. To our right were Georgia's mom, stepdad, and her two sisters. It was supposed to be a perfect day, and our smiles showed that. I found some pens in the kitchen and spent 15 minutes marking up the picture. I drew silly horns and other funny shapes over my family's faces. Then I drew a big belly on Georgia with an arrow pointing to it that said, "This was done by an idiot." I wrote words like fool, liar, and betrayer above my family's heads, along with the silly horns and mustaches. Lastly, I put question marks over Georgia's family. I wasn't sure if they knew what was really going on. I thought we had a strong bond, but I knew Georgia and her sisters didn't always get along well, just like Brad, Joanna, and I didn't spend much time together outside of work or family events. I considered making the picture even worse, but I decided my message was clear enough. I hung it back on the wall. The last thing I did was sit down at the kitchen table and write a note to Georgia. Georgia, by the time you read this letter, it will be clear that I have already left the house. I know this letter will have a lot of feelings in it, but I will try hard not to use bad words. What I'm sharing here is just a small part of the hurt, sadness, and anger I have in my heart right now. By now, I think you have been to my former brother's parents' house. I want you to know that I have cut ties with my family, left Total Build, and don't want to have anything to do with any of you from now on. I came home tonight to surprise you and spend time together. I even called you while driving back, but you were too busy with my former brother to answer. Seeing him with you and knowing what was happening between you two hurt me deeply. Listening to your private talk that showed no respect for me broke a piece of my heart, and I don't know if that part will ever heal. What hurts even more is knowing that the baby growing inside you is not mine, it's his. You all were going to pretend it was mine. Georgia, I gave you everything, and this is how you repay me. Clearly, we are going to end our marriage. I can never forget or forgive what you and my former family have done to me. I've taken most of my things from the house and will arrange to get the rest soon. The rental lease goes on for another 6 months, and my family's company is paying for it, so feel free to use it. I won't be around. I believe the divorce will split our money and belongings in half. I think that's unfair, considering I am the one who got hurt, but I'll accept it if it means you're out of my life. I've told my former parents not to reach out to me, and I ask you to do the same. Right now, I have stronger feelings of hate for you than I had love. But look at it this way. Now you can be open about being with Brad Jr. and raise your child together without worrying about me finding out. If I keep writing, this will just turn into a rant, so I will end here by saying this. Goodbye, Georgia. I hope you have a life full of regrets. Your soon-to-be ex-husband, Robert Other. I know I promised to hold back on swearing, but I wrote this by hand, and I think I did well until the end. I folded the letter and placed my wedding ring on it before leaving the house. Georgia would not be back until the next day. I heard that the sounds of crying and yelling could be heard from 2 houses away, so loud that the police were called. When they found out what happened and saw my artwork, it was clear what had taken place. They left without taking any action, but I'm sure there was some talk at the station. As for me, I called my Muay Thai trainer, Darren Bray. Darren had become a good friend over the past few years. He and his girlfriend Tony had joined Georgia and me at several barbecues. Right now, he was the only person I could think of who wouldn't tell my family what was going on. Darren kindly let me stay in their spare room for a while. When they sat me down on their couch and explained things, I felt like a lost puppy finding its way back home. Over the next couple of weeks, I slowly understood some of my feelings. I first got a lawyer to help with my divorce. Then, I showed my lawyer the video I had taken, and his eyes widened as he watched it. I told him I wanted to be finished with Georgia as soon as possible, and he agreed. I also found a human resources expert to make sure I got all my money from Total Build. Since Darren was my martial arts coach, we trained a lot together. He helped me release my anger during our sessions. Sometimes he had to step in when I almost let my frustration take over. My opponents didn't realize until it was too late that they were up against me. Even though Darren was almost 5 years older than me, he became my best friend in that time. He was someone I could talk to about anything. He took me out and got me relaxed at pubs along the beautiful Gold Coast beaches. He even hugged me when I cried, listening without judging. Tony treated me like family, making big home-cooked meals and always asking about my day. She was there for me during my tough times, as I struggled with sadness. Darren and Tony also helped me use their truck to gather my things from my old place a few weeks after everything had happened. My lawyer set up a time for us to go when no one would be home. I managed to get a couple of chairs, my desk, and my training gear. When we arrived at the house, not much had changed. However, I noticed that the wedding photo was gone. I found it in the wardrobe of the spare bedroom. There was a letter on the table with George's handwriting, but I threw it in the bin without opening it so she would see it when she came back. After about 6 weeks, I received my money from Total Build, including my last paycheck and bonus. With my share of the savings, I had a good amount. My family tried to stop me from getting the money, claiming that I had abandoned my job and was trying to take money unfairly. I went to Fair Work Australia and they quickly backed off. With my payout, I wouldn't need to find work for almost a year, maybe even more, depending on how I lived. The next challenge was that my lawyer began to receive letters from Georgia's lawyer about 4 months later. Georgia wanted to talk instead of moving forward with the divorce. She claimed she wanted to discuss things because a lot of what I overheard was wrong. Finally, I told my lawyer to send a copy of the video to her lawyer. All the requests stopped after that. It had been almost 7 months since the divorce, and I hadn't heard from Georgia or my family in a while. I was finally starting to feel a little better, like maybe life wouldn't be so hard for a change. I was looking for a job and a place to live. Thanks to Darren, I had made some money from a few semi-professional fights, but I knew I needed more to get by. Darren and Tony had been great, helping me through this tough time, but I felt it was time to stand on my own. It was Friday morning around 10. I had slept in after a late-night training session. After I woke up, I took a shower, shaved, and put on some casual shorts and a t-shirt. I was walking down the stairs of Darren and Tony's two-story house when the doorbell rang. "Okay, I'm coming! Hold on!" I called out with a smile. I could hear Tony laugh from the kitchen as I opened the door. I was expecting a delivery person, a mail carrier, or maybe a visitor from a church. But it was my sister Joanna. She stood there looking impatient, and behind her was Georgia's younger sister, Amy, looking shy and a bit embarrassed. I quickly closed the door in Joanna's face. "Nope," I said, shaking my head as I walked away. "Robbie, that was rude," Tony scolded me as she walked into the room, wiping her hands on a dish towel. But then she saw my expression and paused, glancing at the door as Joanna continued to knock. I pointed over my shoulder towards the door. "It's my sister and Georgia's sister." Tony's face fell a bit, and she looked frustrated. She knew how I felt about my family. "Do you want me to send them away?" I nodded. "Could you? I really don't want to talk to them, especially Joanna." Tony went to the door and opened it, but before she could say anything, Joanna pushed her aside and stormed in, starting to yell at me. "You are such a jerk, Robbie, do you know that? Why do you think your life is so special that you can just walk away from everyone?" She looked angry, likely letting out months of frustration, but her anger seemed misplaced, even fake. I stared back at my sister, keeping my expression calm and thoughtful, but I felt a wave of anger inside. She had learned about the affair between my wife and my best friend, but now she was upset because I had decided to step back from the situation. It bothered me that she was more concerned about her own feelings than about how I was hurt. I took a deep breath to remain calm and not say what I really wanted to. "Joanna," I said in a steady voice, "I will ask you nicely. Please leave." She looked at me, scoffing, mistaking my calmness for weakness. She had always treated me like a bully when we were kids. She always thought she could push me into giving her what she wanted. "Do you know how much your leaving has hurt Georgia? She almost lost the baby. She was so upset. And where was her weak husband? Hiding right here." My sister pointed to the house around us. "You know she had to have the baby. Your baby, all by herself," Joanna said, looking for any sign of a reaction from me. I didn't say anything, so she went on. "I think she was so angry she missed how I reacted when she mentioned the baby." Amy stood outside, watching us quietly. Tony leaned against the doorframe. "Joanna just wanted to let out her frustration on me. You," she poked her finger into my chest, "left us all in a tough spot. Mom and Dad are angry, and they've had to let people go because clients are running away. We all have to pick up the slack for you." She mimicked me with a high voice, using air quotes as she said, "All because your little feelings got hurt." Then she balled her fists and pretended to cry like a child. "Boo-hoo, Robbie, grow up! You have a child to take care of and a business to help bring back to life." For the first time, I almost hit a woman. I didn't, but I came close. The anger I felt must have shown on my face because Joanna took a step back, looking unsure. Like with Mom and Dad, my voice was quiet and dangerous. "Do you think I have time for someone who would let my own brother do terrible things in my own bed while they both laugh at me? And how about walking in and hearing them admit they were making a fool of me? But the child you want me to care for isn't mine. It's Brad's." I heard a gasp and turned to see Amy still standing outside. She had her hands covering her face and tears were streaming down. "Robbie, I'm sorry, I didn't know," Amy said, sinking to her knees as she looked up at me. I glared at my older sister, pointing at Amy, realizing not everyone knew the full story. "And look at you. You couldn't just come here and keep ruining my life. You had to drag innocent people into your lies, too." I pointed at Amy, who was now sobbing at the door. "I bet you told her I just had an argument with her sister. You made it seem like my divorce was no big deal, so you both had to come over and fix me so I would go back to work." For a moment, Joanna didn't say anything. Then she looked at Tony, who stood watching it all. Finally, Joanna took a breath and turned back to me. "And what if I did, jerk?" My sister shot back with the same anger I had. "It looks like it took you less than a second to find another woman." "Joanna," I warned her, trying to calm things down, "I'm giving you a warning. Please do not disrespect the people and situations in this house that you don't understand. So what? Your wife has been with your older brother for 3 years. Now you're upset because you found out. You drink too much and you think that solves everything? Don't go and find someone to flirt with and run from your problems. I could see now that Joanna was as out of touch as the rest of my family. I glanced at Tony, who looked amused, arms crossed over her chest. First of all, Tony said as she walked over to Amy, who was slumped against the door, Robbie and I are not what you think. Then, while Joanna and I watched, Tony gently helped Amy to stand. She spoke softly to her, not paying any attention to Joanna. Come on, sweetie, let's get you inside and comfortable. She led Amy to the couch. Second, Tony said after sitting Amy down and then turning back to Joanna, my boyfriend Darren is your brother's Muay Thai coach. Both Darren and I have been helping Robbie after what you all did to him. She paused, but Joanna seemed not to understand. Tony looked at Joanna. Lastly, I have heard all about what your family and his ex-wife put Robbie through. I think him quitting and cutting ties with you all is one of the tamer choices he could have made. I also think your time here is over. There's the door. Don't let it hit you on your way out. Joanna turned to me, clenching her jaw. Robbie, you need to come back. Her voice had a desperate edge, ignoring Tony. Our production is suffering. Sales are dropping. People are not doing their jobs right. We need you. Well, tough luck, Joe, I replied. You can't just come in here acting all high and mighty, blaming me, then try to make me feel guilty. That's not happening. Did any of you do anything when Brad and Georgia were causing problems? Is that idiot still working there? Or did Dad tell him to chill out because he thought I would just forgive you all and come back? Joanna stared at her shoes. Dad really gave them a talking to. Brad has to run all his sales through Dad now. He won't get any bonuses this year. Please, Robbie. Her tone changed from pleading to desperate. We are in big trouble without you. No, Joanna, I said firmly. There are many reasons why I won't come back, but 2 reasons are more important than the rest. She looked at me, waiting. First, I said, raising a finger, my former brother is still there. After everything that happened, you'd think you all would have let him go if you wanted any chance of fixing things with me or saving the company. I can promise that Total Build will fail if he stays. But Robbie, Joanna said, Brad is going to lead the company one day. He's the oldest. Mom and Dad can't just kick him out. I chuckled. That's the dumbest reason I've heard for keeping someone in a job, let alone letting someone unfit run things. I just don't get how people think like that. I went on. While they are struggling without me, putting him in charge would ruin the company in a month. So saying he can't go because he's the oldest is just nonsense, and you all know it. Joanna couldn't argue with that. She clenched her teeth but shrugged, pretending not to care. What's the second reason? She asked quietly, almost nervous. Simple, I said, holding up my second finger. At no point in this situation has anyone shown any remorse. She swallowed hard, and I continued. From the moment I walked into that house after coming back from Melbourne and found them being rude to me while making a mess, everyone has expected me to just accept it. Everyone has made excuses, trying to make me feel bad, telling me I need to get over it. But no one has bothered to ask how I'm feeling or even said they were sorry. That's not true, Robbie. Georgia and Mom told me they're sorry. More excuses. My unfaithful wife said sorry just to distract me. She's sorry she got caught, not sorry for what she did. Mom said it without any feeling and then basically told me to get over it. Saying sorry means more than just words, Joanna. It's about actions and how you really feel. You're here because you're sorry I am not cleaning up everyone's mess at Total Build, not because you're sorry that Brad and Georgia had a child together in my bed and betrayed me. My sister's anger flared again. You know what, Robbie? You're right. I don't care about your hurt feelings. Should Brad and Georgia have done what they did? No. Should we have kept you in the dark? Absolutely. Then she switched her approach, complaining to me. You were happy until then, but you messed everything up for everyone by coming home early. Okay, let me think, I said, tapping my lips as if deep in thought. Because I was good at my job and wanted to show love to who I thought was a faithful wife. So I'm the bad guy? I asked, my voice a mix of anger and confusion. Yes! Joanna shouted, throwing her hands up. If you had just kept to your plans, this wouldn't be a problem. Right. I'd just be an unaware fool. raising another man's child with a wife who doesn't care for me, and a family that only wants what I can give them. I shot back at her. She just didn't see that I was the one who was wronged, or maybe didn't want to admit it. I sighed and raised my hand to stop her reply. Look, Joanna, this isn't going to work. None of you regret anything. In fact, you're all still blaming me, even though you're the ones who messed up. I lifted my eyebrows and said, I've asked you to leave. Tony has asked you to leave. Should we call the police to help you? For a moment, she tried to argue, but then headed for the door, saying, Come on, Amy, this was a waste of time. He's too full of himself to get past this. Amy looked at me for a moment. Actually, Joanna, I want to stay and talk to Robbie. Would that be okay, Robbie? I shrugged. Sure, Amy, I said, looking at my sister. As Tony said, there's the door. Don't let it hit you on the way out. With that, my sister shot me one last look, glanced at Amy and then at Tony. She walked out and slammed the door, making the room shake. A minute later, we heard her car start and then speed off down the street. I knew she was calling family to tell them how stubborn I was. I sat down on the other couch facing Amy, who still had tears in her eyes. Hey, Robbie, Tony said. This wasn't fun, but I'm all cleaned up now. Do you two need me here, or can I leave you alone to talk? Yeah, Tony, thanks for helping out. I appreciate it, I replied. Anytime. Darren will be back around 7 tonight. Thai food, sound good? I chuckled. Sounds perfect. See you both tonight. Tony grabbed her bag and walked out the front door, closing it gently this time. I turned to Amy and she looked back at me. So, this was kind of a surprise, huh? I said, trying to lighten the mood with Georgia's little sister. Amy blushed. Sorry, Robbie. I was in the States when all this happened. When I got back last month, both families were in crisis. What did they tell you? I asked quietly. Amy paused before answering. They mostly said you and Georgia had a big fight that got your parents involved. They said you were being difficult and needed a talk to see reason and come home. I snorted at that. But Robbie, Amy said, her face showing concern. I had no idea about everything else. I just learned that Georgia had been with your brother. I found out that night after 3 years, I said. Amy nodded sadly, starting to understand why I had distanced myself from everyone. And is it true that it's not your baby? She asked, her eyes filled with kindness and curiosity. I'm almost sure it's not. I heard them discuss it when I caught them. Amy looked at me with surprise. I got home early from a trip to Melbourne and found them in my bed. It was a sight I never wanted to see. Amy's face showed her shock at my words. I sighed again, recalling the terrible moment in my mind. I think we'll need to get a paternity test. That's complicated since I'm related to the guy who got her pregnant. I glanced at Amy and asked, Are you okay if I use strong language? Amy nodded and said, It's fine, Robbie. I understand. Coming home to find your wife with another man would be awful. And to find out it's your brother? That's just terrible, especially after 3 years. You're handling it better than I would. I think I would have lost it. We sat in silence for a moment. And what about Joanna, your mom and dad? Amy questioned. You mentioned you were arguing about whether they knew something. Sorry, I didn't catch everything when that lady helped me to the couch. Tony is my Muay Thai mentor's girlfriend. They've been helping me over the last few months. Darren takes me to the gym and helps me train, which helps get out some of my anger. Tony keeps me busy at home so I don't just drown my sorrows in drinks. I looked away. And yes, my whole family knew what was happening from almost the start and didn't tell me. Why? Amy asked, sounding shocked. Apparently for money, I shrugged. Money? That's it? She replied in disbelief. Yep, that's what they told me. They thought I was better off not knowing. They were surprised at how upset I got when I found out. My mom, dad, and Joanna have all told me to just move on. The business is more important. I trailed off. We sat quietly for a moment while Amy thought it over. She sighed, then stood up and walked over to sit next to me on the couch. I'm really sorry, Robbie, she said, placing her hand gently on my arm. Amy, why are you sorry? I asked her. You didn't do anything wrong. It seems they tried to mislead you too, so you don't need to apologize to me. I'm sorry for what you're going through. It's not your fault. She paused, then said, I'm sorry I'm related to someone who has hurt one of the best men I know. She blushed, and I chuckled, agreeing with her. Thanks, Amy. It's good to know someone understands. So, what are your plans for today? Amy asked, changing the subject and sounding a bit more cheerful. I wasn't planning to do much, just training and trying to forget things. Why do you ask? She smiled and said, How about I take you out for lunch to help take your mind off of stuff? Amy held my arm and leaned in a bit closer to me. It wasn't anything intentional, but it felt nice. Sure, let me just change and get ready. Give me 5 minutes. She smiled brightly, like the sun coming out. Amy took me to lunch and we talked about various subjects. I mentioned that I didn't have a job at the moment, while Amy was a bit hesitant to discuss her work, only saying that she traveled a lot. As we chatted, the waiter brought out our meals. I had a chicken parmigiana with fries and a Coke, while she enjoyed a Caesar salad with chicken and bacon. As we ate, we talked more about Georgia and my family. Then she asked what my plans were. Well, I'm very close to getting divorced from your sister. I think that's why Joanna decided to come see me now. I guess this morning was her last try to make me change my mind, stop the divorce, and come back to total build. We looked at each other and smiled. But deep down, we both knew that wasn't going to happen. On a brighter note, I'm thinking about buying a house. So I guess next I need to find a job once the divorce is over, I said. Amy nodded. What about your family? Are you going to reach out and make amends? I frowned at her. Amy quickly sat back. That bad, huh? If I never talk to one of them again before I grow old, it will be too soon, I said firmly, then looked at Amy. So, was there another reason you came with Joanna this morning? She lifted both hands as if to say she meant no harm. Then she sighed and said, When Georgia told Mom and Dad how you left her, it made me really angry with you. The Robbie I know would never do what you did based on her story. You upset me, Robbie. I raised an eyebrow. I could understand her anger, but there was more to the story than what she thought. Amy sighed and glanced at me over her salad. You might not know this, but I've liked you for years. She blushed, and I felt a lump in my throat. When Georgia first brought you home, you were nice to Mom and Dad. You even spent time with me. Then, as you both started dating, I saw how you cared about my sister. You really tried to make her happy. You also thought about her family. You even gave me gifts on my birthday. I don't know many brothers-in-law who do that. I shrugged a little. I'm good at planning, Amy. I focus on the details, and making sure my girlfriend's little sister liked me helped my relationship with her family back then. I know, Robbie, and that's the point, Amy said. You were great as my brother-in-law. It didn't make sense when I heard how you had just left Georgia and how she was struggling because of it. So when I was given the chance to come talk some sense into you with Joanna, I was eager to do it. She looked at me seriously. If you had just left her after a fight, I would have lost trust in all men and relationships. I mean that much to you? I asked, surprised. Amy nodded. Robbie, what Georgia and your family have done to you is terrible, she said, looking out the window of the cafe where we were eating. They were keeping a big secret. Their oldest son was seeing the wife of their youngest son, and to make things worse, the older son had gotten her pregnant. They didn't seem to mind at all. When you find out and ask them about it, they say they did it for business reasons, Amy said, reaching over and putting her hand on mine. If I were you, I wouldn't just walk away. I would leave the country and start fresh somewhere else. I smiled. Believe me, I've thought about doing just that more times than I can count. I just don't have the money right now. I hope to feel sad for a bit, find a new job, and save enough to leave it all behind. We fell into a comfortable silence as I finished my chips and soaked up the gravy on my plate. I could tell Amy wanted to ask something, so I waited. She took a deep breath and caught my attention. Robbie, she said, her eyes shining, if I asked you, would you come away with me? Amy, she may not be the best person, but my ex-wife is still your sister. I chuckled. Half-sister, Amy laughed back. Even though she made a mistake, you're not with her anymore. Since you're almost free, there's no law against me asking. I nodded. That's true. Great, she smiled. So you can come away with me. I laughed, but then saw Amy's serious face under her smile. You really mean it, don't you? Absolutely, Amy replied, smiling softly at me. Amy, I can't do that. Why not? She asked. Well, first of all, I don't have enough money to leave everything behind, I said firmly. She nodded thoughtfully, still smiling. And second, I'm still married. I told the attractive woman across from me. Even if it's just for a little while longer, I need to stay and sort out the legal stuff with Georgia. She nodded again, still looking like she knew something I didn't. And finally, Amy, you're Georgia's sister, I pointed out. Wouldn't it be strange if I ran away with you? She just smiled wider. You make valid points, Robbie, but Georgia and I are only half-sisters, she reiterated, smiling at me. Right, I replied. Georgia shared a father with her older sister Ruth, but their dad, Steve, left soon after Georgia was born. Their mother, Rain, then married Peter Brown, and Amy was born after that. I'd always thought Peter and Rain made a great couple. It seemed like Georgia got her father's bad traits. Good, Amy said. From now on, I want nothing to do with that person. The less family I have with her, the better. I felt thankful that someone understood where I was coming from. To answer your other two questions, Amy continued, her eyes shining. What if we had the money and support to make both problems disappear? She still had that sparkle in her eye that showed she was serious. Amy, I hesitated. Are you really serious? You think you can make it all go away? If you can, I would run away with you. I am serious, Robbie. I can handle the costs and the legal stuff, but Robbie, I want you to be with me. Why? I asked. Because, Robbie, if you are free, I want the chance to see if we can have something special. I believe, if given the chance, I can be everything my annoying older sister isn't, Amy said, shrugging but looking at me with sincerity. I also know that if it doesn't work out, I will have helped someone I really care about escape from a bad situation. Can I think about it? I asked. She laughed. Of course. The offer is open any time. You just have to call me. But I'm only visiting my parents for another week before I head back home, and then I'm going overseas soon. I would love for you to come with me, she said, raising her eyebrows playfully. The rest of lunch went by quickly. I think Amy realized she had surprised me by the looks I kept giving her, but she kept the conversation light and easy. We took a rideshare back to Darren and Tony's place. Before she left to see her parents, she gave me a big hug. I felt she wanted to say more but wasn't pushing for it. During the hug, I noticed she felt warm, like she was trying to support me, not just take energy away like I sometimes felt with Georgia. That night I had dinner with Darren and Tony. First, Tony and I shared the story about Joanna's visit. Then I told them about lunch with Amy and her unusual offer. So, do you think she's for real? Could she actually do that? Darren asked after I explained what she suggested about running away with her. I'm not really sure, I replied. We don't know much about her. All I know is that a couple of years ago she started a job that requires her to travel a lot. She lives a few hours away on the Sunshine Coast and visits family every few months. If she can afford that, I believe she might help me move at least. I'm not sure about the legal part, but she said she wants a chance to show me that she cares since I won't be going back to Georgia. Tony chuckled. That girl really likes you. Darren and I turned to her in surprise. How do you know that? Darren asked. When tall, dark, and handsome here, Tony said, pointing to me, explained why he left her sister. Amy didn't just cry because her sister was sad. She looked heartbroken, like she was focused on Robbie the whole time. She shrugged. That girl has liked you for a long time. I nodded. She kind of hinted at that during lunch. I always thought she was cute, but I was with her sister. But let's say her offer is real. She is Georgia's sister, and I'm feeling really confused about relationships right now. I don't want her to get involved with me just because she's a quick fix. Tony laughed and said, Robbie, how long have we known each other? Maybe 8 or 9 years, I answered. Exactly. Tony nodded. So, let me tell you, that girl is not just a quick fix. I know you're hurting, but I think you've let her into your heart. She won't easily walk away from you. While I would hate to see you go, I think you should give it a shot. We looked at Darren to see what he thought. He took a sip of his drink, glanced at the leftover Thai food, and then back at me. I think I've met her a few times. She's shorter than Georgia, with dark hair and a nice figure, unlike her sister. I chuckled, and Tony playfully nudged him. Honestly, I agree with Tony. I think she likes you. Even if things don't work out, you don't have anything holding you back here. No job, no family. You might not get this chance again. I say go for it with Amy. We chatted for a few more hours. I was still unsure, but starting to lean towards yes. The turning point came 2 days later. I was walking through the mall to renew my driver's license when I saw a cafe. My whole family was there with Georgia, who had a baby in her arms and a stroller beside her. My parents were cooing over the baby, Joanna had a big grin, and Brad Jr. was being silly with my soon-to-be ex-wife. They didn't seem bothered at all that they had hurt me. I stood there watching for about 2 minutes until my mom noticed me. When she did, it broke my frozen state, and I started to walk away quickly. I made it almost 2 blocks before she caught up with me. "Robbie!" I heard my mom shout. "Robbie, wait! Please stop!" She was rushing to catch up with me. I thought about walking faster or hiding in a store to avoid her, but I knew that wouldn't help in the long run. So I stopped and pulled out my phone to call Amy. Amy answered right away as I turned to face my mom, phone to my ear. "All right, gorgeous," I said into the phone. "Let's make this happen." Amy laughed at my tone. "You got it, handsome, but I bet there's someone there you don't want to know it's me, right?" "Mm-hmm," I replied. She chuckled again. "Okay, I'll pick you up at 7 tonight, and you can tell me all about it." I smiled, glancing at my mother. She could tell the smile wasn't for her. "All right. See you then." I hung up. I wiped the smile off my face and looked straight at my mom. "What do you want, Hattie?" I asked with no emotion. "Robbie, please," she pleaded. "This isn't fair. You can't treat us this way. You can't just cut us off. We need you." "Fair?" I shouted, my anger bubbling up. "What is not fair is having my family lie to me for over 3 years. You protected the guy who got my wife pregnant while pretending that I was the dad. Does that sound fair to you?" "But Robbie, it's not the same. We need you," she said again. "You don't need me. What you need is someone to run your business. You want someone to fix all the mistakes your oldest son makes. You want someone who does everything perfectly for you. You don't want a son to care for. You want someone to keep the money coming in." "That's not true." My mother stopped, trying to think of something else to say. "Robbie, you know we all love you." This was the first time she said she loved me since everything went wrong. I laughed. "You all love me? Seriously, you say you love me?" But my laugh turned into a growl. "Then explain how lying to me about so many things is love. Tell me, Hattie," I yelled. She looked at the ground, not knowing how to respond. "People walked by, some glanced at us, but it was just another family fight happening on the Gold Coast." "Because keeping you in the dark was meant to protect you," my father said, coming up behind my mom. Joanna and Georgia followed, with Georgia pushing a stroller, and of course my brother was there too. "We've talked about this before, Brad," I said, using my father's name. "It wasn't protecting me. It built up a lot of pain and betrayal, and I'm the only one suffering." "You're wrong, Robbie," Joanna said. Her tone had changed from before. "We all suffered by keeping this from you, but now you treat us badly. We're hurting too." I glared at her. "Hurting? Really, Joanna? The other day when you came into Darren and Tony's place yelling at me and saying I should forgive the woman, I looked at Georgia, who shrank back. And that loser of a brother," I said, turning to my brother. "None of you know what real suffering is. You think you're suffering because I'm not fixing your problems. You think you're suffering because your profits are down. You think you're suffering because your plans are a mess. I saw you all a few minutes ago. None of you understand what it feels like to be lied to and betrayed, then told to just get over it. Well, forget it. I'm living in a nightmare because of all of you, and none of you care about how I feel." "Son, you never gave us," my father began. "A chance?" I cut him off. He hesitated, looking back at me. "You were going to say something, weren't you? I never let you say you're sorry or that you know how upset I am or that you feel bad about what you did. You wanted to ask for forgiveness for messing with my life. Is that what you were going to say, Brad?" He stared at me, his expression hard. "No, son. I meant to say you never let us explain," my father said calmly. "Explain?" I glared at him, while the rest of the family watched in silence. "Oh, you explained everything just fine. I must be adopted because only someone crazy would believe the nonsense you're telling me. Does the person who hurt me, or the one who messed up, feel sorry for what they did?" I looked around. No one dared to meet my eyes. "Didn't think so," I said. Brad Jr. stepped forward, suddenly smiling. "Robbie, you need to stop feeling sorry for yourself. Georgia and I have a lovely baby boy now. If you just apologize and come back to work, we'll make you the child's godfather." I know it's not the same as having your own kid, but he didn't get to finish his thought. As I mentioned before, I practice a few martial arts. I compete in tournaments against people who are pretty good, and I usually win. We don't have the same money for sports in Australia as they do in the US, so I earn a bit from my fights. Some of those guys can really fight, so my brother never stood a chance against me. With one quick move, I kicked Brad Jr. hard. He flew off the sidewalk and crashed into a wall about 6 feet away. Nobody expected it, just me. My older brother lay there, out cold. For the first time during this whole mess, I felt calm. But then, after a moment of shock, everyone started yelling at me. I heard shouts from every direction as some police officers ran over. They saw the family drama unfold and then me hitting my brother, so they quickly moved to arrest me. As they put the handcuffs on me, my mother lay crying next to my brother. She looked up and asked why I did it. I smiled, wanting everyone, the police and a growing crowd of onlookers, to hear. I told my brother never to come near me again after I caught him with my wife, and I saw he had caused her pain. I warned him that if he did, I would put him on the ground faster than he thought possible. Everyone knows when you make a promise, you keep it. He thought he could treat me badly because he took my wife and had a child that should have been mine while I was still married. While trying to show off, the fool got close enough to me that I could keep my promise. I paused and glanced at the crowd near my mom. She was looking at me with sadness in her eyes. But I really did keep my promise. I turned to the officers. They were trying to look serious, but I could see a smile in their eyes as they understood what I meant. I raised my hands, still in cuffs. "Take me away, officers." They calmly led me to a police car and drove me to the local station, which was just a few blocks away. Once we were off the street, the officers apologized for the arrest and the cuffs. They said it was part of the rules. I told them it was okay, but I expected to be charged. I wasn't going to accept being criticized by my family, especially my older brother, who had acted poorly. At the station, they gave me back my phone and let me make a call, but they would listen in. I called Amy, but it went to voicemail. I left a message saying I had been arrested and asked her to help because I didn't trust my family. After I hung up, I smiled and thanked the officer for letting me use my phone. They logged it with my other things. They took me to an interview room and offered me a drink and some cookies. It seemed that news of my actions had traveled quickly through the station. While they had to do their jobs, no one blamed me for knocking out Brad Jr. I had been sitting there for about an hour when an officer came in and said I had a visitor. I thought it would be Amy or a lawyer, but it was Georgia. "Hi, Robbie," my soon-to-be ex-wife said as she sat across from me. I grunted in response. Not knowing where to look, I glanced at her. She still had some baby weight on her. I guessed her normally small chest was larger now. Her shape was different, but if she worked out like she usually did, she'd lose it all soon enough. Even with everything she had done, she was still attractive. "So, what do you want from me?" I asked, hoping my voice sounded threatening enough. "Haven't you done enough?" "Robbie," she began, her voice trailing off. She looked down at the table, her shoulders drooping. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what we all did to you. You didn't deserve it." She paused and then looked back up at me. "I should never have." But then anger flashed in her eyes. "But you didn't have to do what you did to Brad this afternoon," she said, her voice rising. We glared at each other for a moment, and then I chuckled. "Georgia, you were almost apologizing, but then stopped. Look at it my way. Do you have any idea how angry I have been for the last several months? Do you know how betrayed I feel, not just by you, but by everyone in my family?" She nodded a little, unsure of how to respond. "Georgia, I'm not sure you understand. You all looked happy when I saw you in the cafe with them this afternoon. No one even cared about me," I said, my voice filled with anger. "That's not true," Georgia said. "We've all been sad since you chose to leave. Yes, we know you're angry and hurt, but they are your family, Robbie. They love you. I love you." "Really?" I asked in disbelief. "In your mind, you really think that, Georgia?" She nodded again. "Well, let me tell you what I think about their love. The night I caught Brad with you in our bed, after everything that happened, I drove around feeling lost. I thought I could find comfort in my family, the people I thought would share my anger and hurt about what you and Brad did. But when I got there, I found parents who not only knew about my brother being with you for 3 years, but they also knew the child wasn't mine. They had the nerve to say they didn't tell me because it would upset things for their business and that I was better off not knowing. So where is the love in that? I finished, feeling the weight of my words. Georgia tried to respond several times but couldn't. We fell into a tense silence, both unsure of what to say next. So what do we do now, Robbie? She asked softly. Nothing, I said sharply. We do nothing. We go our separate ways and finish the divorce. Then if I'm lucky, maybe one day I'll find someone who respects me enough to be faithful. She looked at me and started to cry. Robbie, you know I love you, right? It was only ever a fling with Brad. You know that, right? I laughed without joy. Why is it that whenever someone gets caught being unfaithful, they say they only love their partner and the other person was just for fun? It doesn't feel right. But it's true, she argued. It was never about anything serious with him. I'd leave him for you in a heartbeat. I'm sorry that the child isn't yours, but the next one could be. I promise. I raised my hand and slapped my forehead. Georgia looked at me like I was losing it. Sorry, I said, smiling a little. I just had to check if I was awake after hearing that. The next one will be mine. What are you doing here? Georgia asked, looking between Amy and me. I smiled back at her. This is my one phone call, I explained. I couldn't call my family because I don't trust them. But Amy and I had lunch recently, and she said I could trust her. Suddenly, Georgia got angry and tried to slap her sister. Amy quickly caught her hand just as the officer stepped in to break up the fight. You little brat! Georgia shouted. Just because he doesn't want me doesn't mean you can come in and take him away! Amy laughed and let go of Georgia's hand as the officer held her back. I haven't taken him yet, Amy replied, grinning. But just wait and see. He'll forget you ever existed when I do. I couldn't help but smile at what Amy said. At that moment, she seemed much more appealing to me. It felt like she was claiming a place in my life. I found her looking at me, checking me out. Here was a woman who had liked me for a long time. She respected that I was with someone else, but now that I was single, she wanted to win my heart. It seemed like Amy was ready to stand up for me if necessary. Amy laughed when she saw Georgia's shocked face and then mine. She walked around her sister and went into the interview room without saying anything else. She handed me my phone, wallet, and jacket. Come on, you're free to go. No charges, but you'll need to take care of Brad Jr.'s medical bills. He's in the hospital with a mild concussion, bruised ribs, and a sprained neck. Totally worth it, I said with a smirk. I took my phone from Amy while Georgia watched us silently, clearly upset. I hugged Amy, but to everyone's surprise, she pulled me in for a kiss that made me forget about Georgia. The officer had to hold Georgia back again as she watched us. As we left, we passed my mother, who was waiting for Georgia. I said nothing and didn't even look at her, even though I knew she was there. It sent a message. We hurried out of the station and took a ride back to Darren and Tony's place. I wanted another kiss, but Amy laughed and said I'd have to wait. It was just for my sister's sake. Besides, when you're really mine, you won't want anyone else. For a moment, I stood in front of the few boxes that I needed to pack. I didn't have much stuff, but I had to get everything ready. It had been almost a week since I decided to leave with Amy, my ex-wife's younger half-sister. No matter what happened next, I was determined to stop feeling sorry for myself and get my life back on track. I still didn't know what I would do for work since I left the family business, Total Build. The few jobs Darren had found me brought in some money, but not enough to make a real living. Talking with Amy, she told me not to worry about money or work. We would find a way to manage everything together. Our connection with Amy grew quickly, and it felt a bit strange. We weren't officially dating, but it felt like we were a couple. Since I had known Amy for years, it was more about understanding each other better and deepening our friendship. I thought that, like me, Amy sensed it wouldn't be long before we were a real couple. It was a busy time for me. When I wasn't training or hanging out with Darren, Tony, and Amy, I was getting ready to move. Once I figured out what to pack and what I had in storage from my breakup with Georgia, Amy took charge of the moving plans with contacts I didn't even know she had. She handled the movers, the money side of things, and even some legal work for my divorce. When I asked her about it, she smiled and said it was a bit selfish because she was helping me to make a fresh start. Amy had unusual work hours during the day and some evenings. She wouldn't tell me exactly what she did, but said she had to take calls with people in different countries. Most of the time, she worked from a hotel room here on the Gold Coast. When she wasn't busy, we went on dates or just spent time together. Whenever we could, Amy and I enjoyed lunch or dinner out. I loved that she was always by my side when she wasn't working or resting. She came to watch me train with Darren and even saw one of my Saturday afternoon fights against another local. The match ended in a draw, but the way Amy talked about the fight afterwards, you would have thought I had won it decisively. In those first few weeks, I often thought about sharing the same kiss we had in front of Georgia at the police station. It felt mutual because we both had to hold back from going further several times. We talked about it and agreed to take things slowly. We both realized our relationship would grow, but wanted to make sure I was away from my family's influence first. The day before my move, Amy helped me gather everything I had at Darren and Tony's, along with the rest of my items in storage, into a large storage unit. Her movers would come to take everything to her place in a few weeks. I only needed to keep out a few essentials, some clothes, a new laptop, and my training gear. On the evening before the move, Amy and I spent time at Darren and Tony's. The four of us enjoyed a great evening over Thai food. During dinner, we chatted about a lot of things, just like two couples who had been friends for a long time do. Amy held my hand and gave me meaningful looks. We shared a couple of bottles of wine and played some games together. Who would have thought that a little indie game called Throw Throw Burrito could be so much fun? When the night ended, I was surprised that Amy didn't leave like she usually did. Instead, she followed me into the guest room where I was staying. She climbed under the sheets after skillfully changing into something more comfortable without me seeing. I raised my eyebrows in surprise, and she giggled. Then it was my turn to change into some boxers before sliding into bed next to her, opening my arms. She settled in beside me, resting her head on my shoulder. I felt her hand gently touch my chest. "It's okay, Robbie. Even though I want to be closer, I'm not going to rush things tonight," Amy said softly. "But tomorrow you're coming with me, and if I have my way, you won't be sleeping away from me ever again." When I woke up, Amy and I were still close together. I found my hand resting on her back, and it felt nice, a warm way to wake up. Realizing I had moved during the night, I gently removed my hand, and she sighed softly at the motion. "That was nice, Robbie. I wish I could wake up with you holding me like that every day." Her voice was sleepy, but happy, and I felt that same happiness inside for the first time in months. I leaned in and brushed her dark hair away from her neck, giving her a soft kiss while breathing in her scent. If I compared her to Georgia, I could see Amy had a similar smell, but also something different. Georgia smelled sweet like honey, while Amy had a fresh scent, like the air after a rainstorm. After a few minutes of gentle kisses, we got up and got ready for the day, knowing we had our first long drive ahead. We had breakfast with Darren and Tony, enjoying fruit and yogurt. While we ate, Darren made me promise to keep training for the big fight he had planned for me. Amy said she would help me stick to my training routine as we cleaned up and got ready to leave. I loaded the last few bags into my old Toyota Camry, we said our goodbyes, and then we hit the road. For the next few hours, we drove. My car was older, so we didn't have fancy features like Bluetooth or Spotify. Instead, we tuned into a local rock station, keeping the volume low as we talked easily. We chatted about the sights we saw on the road, highway work, religion, and politics. Our talk was interesting, and I was impressed by how smart Amy was, especially when she picked up on the things I mentioned. Her hand often brushed against my leg, and for the first time, I felt like our relationship might truly work. I used to live on the Gold Coast, a little over an hour south of Brisbane. As we drove north, Amy told me she lived about an hour and a half north of Brisbane, mostly on the highway, in a place called the Sunshine Coast. After we passed Brisbane by about an hour, I noticed Amy getting nervous. She started fidgeting and stealing quick looks at me and then out the window. I saw it but didn't say anything. I fell quiet, allowing her to think about whatever was making her anxious. I was starting to have strong feelings for Amy, but her behavior confused me after the month we'd spent together. It seemed like she wanted me with her, but she looked more worried than excited, like she had a big secret she was scared to share. I held back my questions, knowing that I would find out what was happening sooner or later. When we finally got off the highway, Amy guided me to a gas station with a small diner so I could fill up my car. When I went to pay, Amy followed, holding a bag carefully. I paid for the gas, and then she waved for me to sit with her at the quietest table in the small cafe. "Robbie," she said, reaching out to touch my arm, "I hope you know how much this means to me. The last few months together have felt like a dream come true." "I have a feeling there's something else," I replied, unsure of where this was leading. She gently bit her lip and nodded, pulling out a folder from her bag. "There is something else, but it's not what you think. I need you to trust me because what I'm about to share is important. My parents and sisters don't know what I'm going to tell you." I looked at her in surprise as she handed me the folder and asked me to read the papers inside. While I started reading, Amy went to get us some drinks. She came back a few minutes later with a Coke for me and lemonade for herself. The papers were legal forms explaining that Amy was sharing something serious with me, and I needed to be careful about what I said to others. It said I could get into trouble if I talked to the wrong people, like my family. The forms reminded me of the legal papers I signed every year for my work. While I was reading, Amy watched me while sipping her drink. She looked worried. When I finished, she pulled out a pen from her bag and handed it to me. I looked back at her. "Do you trust me?" she asked, her voice shaky. I took a moment to look at the woman in front of me. I had known Amy since she was 15. Back then, she was very thin and flat. Now she had curves that could catch anyone's eye. Her pale skin, straight black hair, and bright blue eyes made her stand out. I tried to see her not just as my girlfriend, but as someone I could work with. She seemed confident, but also nervous, asking me to sign something without explaining it fully. Amy hadn't mentioned any of this before we arrived, nor had she waited to surprise me at our destination. I thought back to last night, when we were close in bed, even though I was still going through my divorce from her sister. After reading the papers, I didn't see anything crazy in it, like being forced to do something extreme. I wanted to trust her. I took the pen from her and began to sign the papers. With each signature, Amy's smile grew bigger. Once I was done, I handed her the folder with the signed papers. She put it back in her bag, and I noticed she was shaking a bit. Amy walked around the table, set down her bag, and sat on my lap. She kissed me softly, then pulled back and looked me in the eyes. "I love you, Robbie. I hope you know that." I chuckled. "Amy, I just signed some serious papers. I'm not agreeing to marry you." She pretended to be hurt as she moved away and sat on the other side of the table. Picking up her drink, she smiled at me. Just as she was about to sip her lemonade, she paused and looked at me from the side. "Not yet," she teased, taking a drink. "Huh?" I said, distracted by her. "You haven't said yes to marrying me." "Yet," she smiled at me. "Well," I laughed, "I guess the day is still young." We joked about silly things for a little while until an older couple nearby got up and left, leaving us alone. "Robbie," Amy said, getting serious as she watched them go, "thank you for signing those papers. I know it was tough for you to trust me after what your family has been through." I nodded, letting her speak. "Let's start from the beginning," she said seriously. "I want you to understand why we are here and why those papers matter." She looked at me closely, and I kept quiet, just nodding. "If you remember, when we first met, I was a bit of a nerd, right?" she asked. I laughed. "A bit? Amy, you were only 15, and you were a huge nerd. You could do things with computers that I still don't get." She laughed and gave my hand a gentle squeeze. "No, you're not wrong, and yes, I was a nerd, and I still am," Amy said proudly, smiling wide. "One thing I did back then was play around with crypto and cryptocurrencies, like Bitcoin mining before it was worth much." I raised my eyebrows, understanding where she was going. "Yes," she nodded. "I had a lot of Bitcoins when their value shot up. I was smart about selling most of them at the right times." "So you're rich?" I asked, curious about my new girlfriend's finances. "That's one way to say it," Amy replied quietly. "After cashing out a lot of my crypto, I didn't just sit back. I took my money, researched, and started an investment company called ALRO. I invested 90% of what I made into the company. Now I spend most of my time as a venture capitalist. I find companies and startups that will make a good profit. I have a small team, about 6 people here on the coast, a few in the US, and some in Europe. In the past year, we have done really well. We've even attracted U.S. investors to help fund our next projects. Amy smiled at me, looking pleased. You know how much people in America like a strong Aussie. I'm young, pretty, a woman, and I can say hello just like they want, so Alro makes a good profit. How much profit? I asked, curious if she would share the amount. Amy looked at me for a moment, then smiled. After expenses, Alro made a $6 million profit last year. $6 million? Profit? I couldn't believe it. Yes, that's right. And I get 10% of the profit, she told me proudly. Wow! Just wow! I looked at Amy with new respect. She was really smart. She gave me a big smile in return. So that's why there are legal agreements, Amy explained. I don't tell many people outside of my work, and I haven't told my folks because I didn't want them to ask for money. They think I just work at an office, not own a business. It won't matter much in a few years when I have my own family. But right now, I want to keep things private. I couldn't help but laugh. My girlfriend had been hiding her success from us all this time. So what happens now? I asked. I take you home, and we live happily ever after, she said with a big smile. We both smiled at each other and chatted for a few minutes while I processed what Amy had just told me. Then we got back in the car, and Amy guided me the rest of the way to her house. When you think of people with money, you picture grand homes in the hills or large houses by the mountains. Amy's house was more like the second. As we drove through the lovely town of Noosa, Amy had me drive up a hill to her neighborhood. We went through a pair of big security gates into a beautiful resort-like area. There were palm trees, neat lawns, and bright flowers everywhere. Then we reached her house. It looked modern with lots of pillars and smooth lines, looking fancy but not showy. I parked under the awning as Amy told me, feeling a bit shy about my old car in front of such a nice place. But Amy didn't mind at all. She unlocked the big double doors with a swipe card and helped me with my bags. As we walked in, I noticed rooms on both sides, but we headed straight into a living area that faced the Pacific Ocean. I stood there amazed by the view. "Do you like it?" Amy asked, wrapping her arms around me from behind. For a moment, I couldn't say anything, taken away by the sight. "Amy, it's incredible. I don't think I've ever seen a view this beautiful," I finally replied. I loved the ocean, and when I needed to run as part of my workouts for my fights, I often preferred the beach over a treadmill. This would be a nice place to train. Amy laughed while hugging me, her arms around my waist as I looked at the view. "You should see Mrs. Raditz's view from her place up the hills. She's an old lady who takes care of me a bit. Her balcony is even higher up. The view from there is amazing, but thanks for this." Amy then took me up a small set of stairs into the main bedroom. It was nicely decorated, with a big TV on one wall and a PlayStation and Xbox below it. I smiled, just like Amy did. She loved her games, even here. To one side of the room, there was a door to a bathroom and a walk-in closet. On the other side, a balcony had a huge glass wall and sliding door. I walked over to the door and opened it to the balcony. I stepped outside, closed my eyes, and took a deep breath of the sea air. I instantly felt the worries from my time on the Gold Coast fade away. My divorce from Georgia was almost done, and my family was far enough away that I wouldn't have to see them for a long time if I didn't want to. I must have been standing there for a few minutes. Before I knew it, Amy came up beside me, handing me a drink, Kraken and Coke. It looked like she had the same. I raised an eyebrow, and she smiled at me. "Hey, I've liked you for a long time," she said with a grin. "I know you love this drink, so why wouldn't I like it too?" I laughed and held my glass to the side, clinking it with Amy's, then took a couple of big sips. As I enjoyed the taste of the rum, we sat in the chairs on the patio, and it was quiet for a bit. The only sound was the waves crashing on the shore, a nice rhythm in the background as I took in the view. "A Bitcoin for your thoughts?" Amy asked, laughing. I smiled back. "Amy." I started, then paused, letting my shoulders drop. I stood up again and leaned on the balcony railing, looking out at the ocean. A moment later, I felt a gentle hand on my arm. I didn't know why, but I started to cry. Tears fell from the balcony to the ground below, leaving wet spots on the polished concrete. I glanced at my new girlfriend, who looked at me with concern. I think she understood this moment had been coming for a while. Being away from everything helped me relax. which was the first big step toward healing. After a few minutes, I took a deep breath, looking down at the drink in my hand and then back at the ocean. Amy, in the past year, I've felt a lot of anger and sadness, and I've been lost. I used to think I had a loving family, and I had a wife I believed wanted to be my whole world. I even thought I'd be a dad. I swallowed hard and gave Amy a sad smile at that thought. She touched me gently again but didn't say anything. I've spent too much time feeling sorry for myself. I might have done something really serious if it weren't for Darren and Tony in those early days. I felt Amy's hand squeeze mine as she took a deep breath, but she didn't say anything. I saw a ship on the horizon and smiled. A few months ago, Joanna came to talk to me, bringing a woman along for support. I looked at her and she smiled back at me. This woman apparently has liked me for years but never told anyone. Amy nodded and smiled, still quiet. Since then, she has followed me everywhere, calling me every day I can't see her, holding my hand and never wanting to let go when I do see her. We laugh together, and I know she'll be there for me in my sadness too. She knows what it's like to lose a sister, but then she asks me to escape with her, bringing me here. I pointed to the ocean and then to the house behind us. I found out that she loves me. She's rich, very smart, has a great sense of humor, a beautiful smile, and these amazing blue eyes that are as lovely as the ocean right now. I turned and gently held her chin, sliding my hand to touch her cheek as I looked into her eyes. Amy, I said, taking a deep breath, ready to say what I felt. You told me earlier that you love me. I know I have a lot of hurt inside me, but you brought me here because you care. I know I feel it too. It started growing when Joanna left and you chose to stay. I'm scared about admitting this, but Amy, I love you too. Robbie? Amy asked softly, a little shaky in her voice. You love me really? She asked as if she couldn't believe it. Seeing the tears in my eyes, I nodded. I do, Amy, I really do. I know I'm not perfect, but I love you as much, if not more, than I loved Georgia. It feels stronger, too, because this is just the start of you and me. I love you because you haven't asked for anything from me. You never demanded anything. When I see you, my heart races. When you're not around, it feels like the warmth is gone. When my phone rings, I hope it's you. Every day I can't imagine leaving you, even if you didn't have this. I gestured around us again. I thought we'd be in some small rented apartment with noisy neighbors partying all night. Amy laughed. We can move there if you want, but I like this place. As long as I'm with you, I'm happy anywhere. I smiled, giving her a soft kiss before we sat back down at the table on the balcony. So what's next? I asked. Amy took a sip of her drink and thought for a moment while we settled into our seats. Well, she said, not many people know about ALRO outside of the investment world, and the ones who do are also bound by the same privacy rules as you. Believe it or not, I have to follow them too. I raised my eyebrows in surprise. I want to keep my money safe, Robbie. I've worked hard for it. It was lucky timing at first, but I succeeded because of that privacy. We invest quietly as private equity. Most of the time, it turns out well with the right guidance. As for us, Amy said seriously, I really want you to join me. I need to visit ALRO's teams in the US and Europe, and I'd love for you to come along. You want me to come with you? I asked, raising my eyebrow again, making her giggle. Yes, Robbie. I meant what I said last night. I want you with me every night. I want you away from my difficult sister and your messy family for a few months. When we get back, I have an idea for you, she said, a little smile playing on her lips. I laughed. I believe you. I thought for a moment. I was learning that Amy always had a plan. Okay, let's do it. Her smile was contagious, and I found myself looking at her. Amy, I said with a playful grin, will you be my girlfriend? She didn't answer immediately, but she set her drink down and kissed me softly. That's a yes, I said as she pulled away. She playfully slapped my arm. Of course. I've been your girlfriend since I helped you out of jail. We both laughed, and then we pulled our chairs closer, spending the afternoon discussing all the places she wanted to show me. Later that night, we had dinner at a nice Italian restaurant just a 10-minute walk from her house. Amy was more excited than I had ever seen her. She couldn't wait to take me along and introduce me to her life. When we returned to her house, she showed me where I could unpack my bags. She pointed out drawers in the walk-in closet that were just for me. Then she left to make some calls, telling me to explore the house and take a shower to relax. I wandered around, amazed by everything. There were 5 bedrooms, including one for her and 2 that shared a bathroom. The other 3 had their own small bathrooms, and all the bedrooms had a view of the water. She also had a well-organized workout room with weights, a punching bag, and different machines. I was impressed. After looking around more, I discovered a media room with seating for about 12 people and a wine cupboard that was temperature-controlled and well-stocked. Her kitchen was large and had a pantry, plus there were 3 ovens for cooking. As I explored, I could hear Amy in what I guessed was her office. She was on a conference call discussing different companies I didn't recognize. From what I heard, she was asking for many financial reports. I also caught her mentioning to someone, a woman with a British accent, that we would be visiting soon. I peeked into her office, which was spacious and filled with monitors, TVs, and cameras while she waited for a call to connect. She waved for me to come in. I smiled and shook my head. I wanted to step lightly into her work life. I went back to the master bedroom and jumped into the shower. The water pressure was amazing, and it felt like my worries were washing away. Afterward, I sat on the deck, enjoying the view and the cool evening air. I called Darren and Tony to let them know that Amy and I had arrived safely. They were curious about the place, but I didn't share too many details, unsure of what I could say. We started talking about my training for the upcoming fight, and halfway through, Amy came out onto the balcony with a smile when she realized I was on the phone with Darren and Tony. I put it on speaker, and we chatted for about half an hour about the trip. Darren even grilled me about my training schedule. I laughed at his question, saying, "You should see the gym setup Amy has here, Darren. It's going to be amazing to train in." Instantly, I realized that I shouldn't have said that and looked at Amy in surprise. She just laughed back at me. "It really is, Darren," Amy said, her eyes bright. "I use it when I can, but honestly, I set it up for Robbie about a month ago so he would have a place to train. We'll get you up here soon. Sound good?" "Sounds great. Can't wait to see your new place, Robbie," Darren replied, and I could hear the smile in his voice. I mouthed sorry to Amy, but she just smiled back, telling me not to worry. She signaled that she was going to take a shower and told me to keep chatting. Darren and I talked about how I was preparing for my first big fight coming up in a few weeks in Brisbane. It was a big deal since it was my first professional fight. Darren thought I was ready. This time we would have to drive from different directions instead of going together. A few minutes later, I hung up and walked back into the room. Amy, freshly out of the shower, walked out of the bathroom. "Amy, I'm really sorry about the gym comment. I just My words trailed off, and I couldn't finish my thought. Amy stood in the doorway between the bedroom and the bathroom, wearing a simple outfit that caught my attention. Once, there were delicate pieces of fabric covering certain parts of her body, but they were mostly lace. I've mentioned before that Amy and Georgia look alike in some ways, but that's pretty much where their similarities end as sisters. They are only half-sisters, sharing the same mother, but having different fathers. Amy's dad, Peter, is one of the most laid-back, wonderful guys I know. You can see that Amy gets many of her looks from him. Right now, Amy's figure really stands out compared to George's. On the other hand, George's dad, Steve, doesn't seem to have the best genes. But that's not fair, as their older sister Ruth also has Steve as her father, and as far as I know, she is very devoted to her husband. But let's get back to the main story. I've talked about Amy's black hair and blue eyes before. Now, standing in the doorway, I was seeing the woman I was falling for showing off her wonderful body for the first time. Her long black hair flowed over her shoulders, partially covering her chest. Her smooth, fair skin looked radiant, still glowing from the shower she had just taken. Amy wore just a touch of makeup, not too much, but it made her even more attractive. I must have been staring a bit too long because she burst into laughter. "Do you like what you see?" she asked, swaying her hips playfully as she walked toward the bed. "Amy, you are the most beautiful person I've ever seen," I said as she stepped into my arms, and our lips touched, filling the air with electricity. Amy smiled as we pulled away after what felt like forever. We looked into each other's eyes. "I bet you say that to all the girls," she teased. For a moment, I thought carefully. "You are the first woman to make me lose my train of thought like this," I replied, and we continued to smile as we exchanged sweet little kisses. "Then come here and show me how much you care," she said softly as we moved over to the bed. "Arid, you were amazing. How could I—" Hutter behind those tears. The worry she felt faded when she saw I wasn't judging her past. The next month was busy. Amy introduced me to her team in Noosa. I also met her housekeeper and gardener who kept everything neat, especially when Amy was away. When they realized who I was, they smiled a lot during the introductions. They all knew Amy had liked me for a long time, and it made them happy to see her so cheerful. Amy also found time for us to meet her lawyer, George Brady. He was an older man who looked important, like you would expect from a successful lawyer. At Amy's request, George became my lawyer for the divorce. He handled all of Amy's legal needs, and now that I was with her, he was handling mine, too. George told me I needed to meet with Georgia in a few weeks to sign the final papers, and he would come with me. As we went through my case, George mentioned that, like often happens, Georgia's lawyer was trying to slow things down. Georgia thought I might change my mind about the divorce if she fought back hard enough. But in my mind, nothing would stop the divorce. We had clear proof, thanks to my video and a paternity test, that Georgia's son, who was related by blood, was not my child. There would be no going back for me, and neither Georgia nor my family could persuade me to reconsider. I told George that, at first, Georgia and my family tried to make people believe the child was mine. They stopped when my first lawyer pointed out that this could be seen as trickery, which could make them all look bad if it came out. George felt confident that we could finish the divorce without any problems. I was a little taken aback when he shifted the subject and looked at me seriously. He advised me to take good care of Amy. He saw her more like a daughter he needed to protect, rather than just a client. In reply, I smiled and told him I would make sure he didn't take advantage of Amy since he was a tough lawyer. By the end of our chat, we were laughing like good friends, having joked with one another. We both knew we cared for Amy a lot. It was unusual, but for the first time in my life, I liked a lawyer. Over the next few years, George became a close friend. I think Amy and I spent more time with him and his wife, Cynthia, than with anyone else. George also helped me get my passport renewed and sorted out the visas I needed to travel with Amy on her upcoming trip abroad. We were set to leave a few days after the divorce was finalized. What was taking up my thoughts was the fight I had coming up. It was my first professional fight, and it was going to be in Brisbane. I felt a bit anxious because it would be shown on one of the cable channels. I was up against a professional fighter from the US. He would use me as a warm-up before facing one of the top Australian fighters in a match scheduled for a few weeks after mine. I was ready for a tough fight. I knew I could hold my own against him, but I didn't expect to win. I was amazed when Amy got Darren and Tony to agree to keep things private a few weeks before the fight. She brought them in to help train me for the last 2 weeks. The plan was for Darren to train me while Tony helped with my meals. Once they got over the surprise of Amy's situation, Darren pushed me hard. He made me work out for hours every day. We ran 10 kilometers on the beach twice a day, with Darren making me run in the soft sand for half of that before tiring me out in the gym. Darren's regular job was as a trainer at a martial arts gym. We met a few years back when I wanted to learn different martial arts. At first, I trained for mental focus. The various moves helped clear my mind and taught me how to handle things better in business. After training with me for a while, Darren believed I had the potential to be a good amateur MMA fighter. He thought I could benefit from local competitions. For the next few years, Darren became my coach for many fights. We didn't earn much, just enough for a few drinks. But over the last year, my reputation as a fighter grew. My desire to let out my frustrations caught the attention of the National MMA League, and they wanted me to fight a professional. Since it would be on TV, win or lose, we would get a nice paycheck. For Darren, even a tie would be almost 3 months' worth of pay. I didn't have a job, so earning some money felt good and made me feel less like I was just living off Amy. Every other day, Darren changed our routine. We would run twice as far with some light workouts, and then spend hours watching videos of my upcoming opponent, discussing strategies. But the best part of my day was the evenings. Amy gave me amazing massages that helped my tired muscles, which felt really nice. Tony cooked our meals. I was used to strict diets before a fight, but this one was even more serious. She made sure I managed my calories, sugar, and fat. Tony was great at this, and I was glad the food didn't taste bland. When she wasn't focusing on my meals, Tony spent a lot of time with Amy. I noticed Tony started to act like an older sister to Amy. Tony had lost her younger sister in a terrible boating accident a long time ago, so I was happy that my girlfriend brought Tony some comfort. On fight day, Amy, Darren, Tony, and I drove to Brisbane in Darren's truck. I was surprised to see a few of Amy's staff were coming too. They had never seen an MMA fight before. MA stands for Mixed Martial Arts. I trained hard in karate and Muay Thai. I believed this mix made me strong and ready for the fight. In the dressing room, we prepared for the match. While Amy and Tony watched, I did my warm-up with Darren. We spent time stretching and moving around. I wanted to be fully ready when I entered the ring. About an hour before the fight, the event organizer came in. He told us that the reporters and camera crews were ready for the pre-fight meeting. My opponent, Cody McGuinness, was a tall man at 6'3". He had broad shoulders and strong arms. He was mostly a boxer, though he also trained a bit in taekwondo. Cody turned professional in boxing a few years back and had won 3 matches by knockout. He was ranked mid-level in the U.S. MMA League. Not everyone knew him, but he had enough fans to catch the attention of cable sports channels. He made a decent living, but I wondered how he could save money when he had to support a whole team that traveled with him everywhere. When we moved to the interview area, Cody and I took some photos together first and then separately. We posed in a few tougher stances before we went to the weigh-in. Cody seemed like a nice guy under all the tough talk, but he acted like he was sure he would win. After we finished with the photos, he came over to shake my hand. "I wish you luck tonight, Robbie. But I feel sorry that I have to beat you," Cody said with a serious look. I chuckled, thinking he was starting some mind games. Many fighters tried to play with each other's heads. "All good, mate," I responded, joking around in a funny Australian accent. "Just make sure they can put off your next fight after I take you down." I grinned back. He laughed and put his hands on his hips. "Sure, little man, believe what you want. Just so you know, I've already arranged an ambulance for you. If your girl over there needs a ride later, I'll be happy to help," he said, nodding towards Amy. Then he turned and walked away like I didn't matter. I looked at Amy and she was blushing from Cody's comments. "Don't worry about it, honey. He's just joking. It's all part of the game to try to distract me before the fight," I said as I approached her. "I know that," she replied, watching him leave. "But that was still uncalled for." I laughed. "Actually, that was pretty mild. Some guys get really rough and insult you like mad." We both shared a laugh at that. "Speaking of ex-wives," Tony chimed in, looking a bit shy, "your family is in the audience tonight." "What?" Amy and I shouted in surprise, looking at Tony. She nodded. "I'm sorry, but I thought you should know now so you can get ready," Tony said. "I saw them in line for tickets earlier. It seems like everyone is here. Georgia, Joanna, your parents, and even your brother." "Great, just what I need," I said, feeling down. Suddenly, Amy grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the crowd. "Use it," she whispered urgently. "Use what?" I asked, confused. "Them," she said, pointing to the stage doors where the audience would soon fill the room. "Turn the hurt they caused you into strength. If you can't get past it, then push it forward and let it fuel your fight. Show them how angry you are." About an hour later, I felt relaxed and ready as I stepped into the ring. I stole a quick glance at my family. They waved, but I turned away without responding. The match was in a small arena that was about half full. It could have been hosted at a fancy gym, but the organizers wanted Cody to get used to this place for his bigger fight in a few weeks. Everyone said I was just a warm-up for him. The arena held more than 700 seats. My family got their tickets at the door and were sitting far away, which pleased me. None of them had ever seen one of my fights before, including Georgia. She always thought it was too rough, although she liked that I stayed fit. But she refused to come when we were together. With our divorce coming up, it was clear they were trying to win me back to total build. I believed the upcoming court date was the real reason they came, to try to change my mind. Through Amy's dad, Peter, I learned that Total Build was struggling. My parents had to let go of about a third of the staff. They lost several clients because of mix-ups with quotes, including the job that took me to Melbourne and started all this trouble. While Peter said he enjoyed being a dad, Georgia was having a tough time with Brad Jr. My older brother wasn't living up to his responsibilities. After I left, he quickly moved in with my ex-wife. The rumors I heard painted him as a lazy father who preferred to drink or avoid home instead of taking care of his son. He even called the boy the brat, thinking it was funny. So with a sense of satisfaction knowing my family was struggling, my ex-wife was unhappy, and fueled by anger that they showed up to watch me fight, I was ready to put up a strong fight against Cody. Cody entered the arena to a much bigger cheer than I received. Music played loudly, and a big video showed how he believed he was the best in what he saw as a small Australian town. We touched gloves and moved to our corners. When the bell rang, we both rushed out. With his boxing skills, Cody aimed straight for my face with quick punches to throw me off balance. I skillfully avoided him, targeting his legs with some kickboxing moves. Cody almost fell 3 times in that first round, but managed to stay on his feet. He landed a couple of solid punches on me that really hurt. But I also hit him a few times, knowing I had done some damage. By the end of the first round, I thought we were about even. When the bell rang for the second round, Cody seemed less confident and much more careful. In round 2, we exchanged punches again. As a boxer, he kept trying to hit my head, aiming for a big hit. He connected with a few more punches, which made me slightly dizzy. But I fought back, landing many punches to his body, legs, and even one to his head. Still, he stayed on his feet despite it all. In round 3, we moved around, and the referee had to step in to separate us when we got too close. That's when I made a big mistake. For a moment, I took my eyes off Cody. I got distracted by my older brother, who was laughing and pointing at me. In that quick moment, Cody's punch struck my face, and I hit the ground hard. I was stunned for a moment, and the referee began to count. By the time I realized what happened, he was at 4. I stood up, and the referee looked me in the eyes, asking if I was okay to keep going. I nodded but glanced past him at Brad Jr., who was grinning and chatting with everyone around him, his arm around George's shoulder as my parents and sister laughed at whatever he was saying. I felt a surge of anger. I shook my head, clearing my thoughts as the referee stepped back. Suddenly, Cody and I were back at it again. My punches had more strength now, and I started using my legs and knees more effectively. Cody was surprised and began to defend himself, keeping his arms up to block my attacks. After a tough exchange where I really hit him hard and took a quick breather, I saw a chance. He was shifting his stance, probably thinking I would let the round end for a break. Honestly, that had been my plan too. I was still recovering from his hit and feeling tired from my angry attacks, but then he made a mistake when he lowered his arms for a moment, thinking I was out of reach. That was my chance. That's when I made my move. Just like I had done to Brad on the street, I jumped at Cody with a flying kick, hitting him on the head. Everything felt like it was happening in slow motion as I kicked. Time seemed to stretch as my leg moved through the air. The noise from the crowd faded, and it felt like everyone was watching my foot as it headed toward Cody's head. I turned my body in midair, adding power to my kick, and my foot hit him on the cheek. The sharp intake of breath from the crowd is something I'll always remember. For a moment, nothing happened, just a brief pause as the force moved from my foot to Cody's head. I finished my turn as Cody fell against the side of the ring, his body flopping like a doll tossed by a little child. He landed on his side with his mouthguard hanging loose. His body twitched, but his eyes were shut, and he started to drool. No one spoke as the shocked referee hurried to Cody, counting out loud. Cody remained still. When the bell rang, the astonished crowd erupted with cheers. I raised my fist in the air, turned to face the crowd, and kept celebrating. When I looked back at Brad Jr., Georgia, and my family, they were the only ones not cheering. Brad looked scared, probably remembering my move from a few months ago. I locked eyes with him and whispered, "You got this." My brother sat down. I knew he understood. An ambulance crew entered the ring, checking on the still unconscious Cody McGuinness. After using smelling salts and doing quick checks, he was carried out on a stretcher to the local hospital for a checkup. The referee took my hand and spoke into the microphone. "The winner by knockout, your new champion, Robbie," the referee announced. Before I realized it, Darren, Tony, and Amy were in the ring with me. Darren had the biggest smile on his face, and Tony clapped, beaming with pride. Amy hugged me tightly, almost knocking the wind out of me as I winced a bit. I might have some bruised ribs, but then she kissed me, making the crowd cheer again. I noticed three things as I looked up. First, the sports reporter was waving his arms wildly, talking to the camera. Second, Amy clung to me, her pride shining through. And third, my family had spotted Amy with me, and they seemed to be arguing with Georgia. I pointed my family out to Darren, Tony, and Amy. They looked over, and we all laughed as my family shouted back and forth. For the next 2 hours, I went through post-match checks. Darren was also pleasantly surprised by our winnings, which turned out to be much more than anyone expected because everyone thought I would lose. Cody is a big MMA star, and this time, we had more than enough money for drinks. After the match, I did the interview, and reporters wanted to know what got me fired up in the third round. I made up some story about how I pushed myself harder. Then they asked about my finishing move. Well, I smiled. I have to thank my brother for that one. He inspired me a few months ago. My family might not ever see this interview, but who knows? When I finished, I went back to the dressing room and Darren, Tony, and Amy came with me. That was nonsense. Amy laughed when we were away from the reporters. I looked at my girlfriend surprised. Her face was playful, not angry. Excuse me? I asked, as Darren took off my hand wraps and Tony brought over an ice bucket. I said nonsense. That was complete nonsense what you just told that reporter, Amy said, now giggling, and we all know it. Well, I chuckled in response. What could I say? I got angry because my brother was teasing me and had my soon-to-be ex-wife with him trying to mess with me. That's one way to put it, Amy said, holding back her laughter. But I know the real story. Suddenly, she burst out laughing, and Tony, Darren, and I joined in. Darren finished taking off my wraps and put my hands in the ice for about 15 minutes. My gloves were lighter than most, so my fights tended to be tougher on my body. Even though I won, Cody still hit me hard. I realized that if it wasn't for my brother trying to get into my head, I might not have come out on top. I had to think about that. Robbie, you were great out there tonight. I don't think anyone was ready for that outcome, Tony said, sitting down on a bench. Not even me, I said, also taking a seat. My knuckles were finally starting to feel better. I thought I might have some minor swelling later. Cody was a strong opponent. You did well, buddy, Darren said with a nod. At one point, when you got back up after that hit, I was worried you'd lose control, but you channeled your anger, found your chances, and wow, Robbie, where did that kick come from? I explained that I tried a similar move against Brad a couple of months ago. Up until then, Darren and Tony knew I had been in the police station, but they didn't know that I had put Brad in the hospital for 2 days with a concussion. We kept laughing as we talked about moments from the fight, and my body started to relax. Darren said I was finally cooling down and took me into a different room to give me a massage, working out the knots in my muscles before I could feel any soreness. After that, he told me to take a shower in the locker room. When I got there, I found Amy in the shower, surrounded by steam. She had some soap and a washcloth. I smiled as she said it was her turn to take care of me. As she washed me, I thought that Amy should come to all my fights if my post-fight showers were going to be like this. Darren and Tony were waiting for us when we came out of the showers about 20 minutes later. They had big smiles on their faces, probably because of the sounds they had heard from the locker room. I felt more relaxed than ever after a fight. Most of the crowd had left, including my family, which made me feel better. We checked in with the event staff, and I got the okay to leave the arena. It was just after midnight when we stepped out of the arena. I was tired and happy that Darren and Tony would drive us back to Amy's place. They wanted to spend a few days at the beach with us on the Sunshine Coast instead of the Gold Coast, where we had all lived for most of our lives. As we walked toward Darren's truck, we heard someone call out, "Robbie, wait!" my mother almost yelled. They must have been waiting at one of the public gates for us to come out for the past few hours. My family looked tired. My mother was running ahead, looking anxious. I turned to look at her. Amy's hand was still in mine, and Darren and Tony were a few steps behind us. "Robbie, please wait, don't go," my mother begged as she got closer. I let go of Amy's hand and crossed my arms over my chest. I looked at my mother. She looked like she was struggling. Her hair was almost white now, while just a year ago it was brown with a few gray strands. She had deep lines on her face, and even though she was never very athletic, she used to be fit. Now she was breathing hard. "What is it, Mom?" I asked as Amy put an arm around my waist. My mother glanced at Amy and then focused on me. I mean Robbie. Joanna, Brad Jr., Georgia, and my father caught up to us, forming a loose circle around Amy and me. Darren and Tony stayed a little further back, with Tony leaning on Darren. My father looked at Amy quickly before turning back to me. "Son, come home. It's been a year now. We've moved past it, but it's time for you to return," he said. Both Amy and I laughed. "Return?" I asked, grinning. "Yes, son, return," my father said firmly, acting like he was talking to a young child. "You should never have walked away from us." "We need you to stop being so stubborn and come back," Amy said. "Sure," I replied, stretching the word out. Amy scoffed. "And you actually forgive him?" she asked, sounding angry. "Be quiet, Amy, this isn't your issue," Georgia snapped at her younger sister. "Amy?" my mother said before Amy could answer. A look of understanding crossed her face as she saw my girlfriend. "You're Georgia's little sister?" "Half-sister," Amy answered with a smirk. "But yes, I'm stuck with a sister who has other men on the side." The sisters shot daggers at each other with their eyes. "Honestly," Amy continued, grinning at Georgia, "I think she got her bad luck from her dad. My dad is really loyal to our mom." "Stop it, Amy," Georgia said again. "Robbie is still my husband." "Only for a few more days, then he's all mine," Amy said happily, wrapping her arms around my waist protectively. Georgia glared at her sister. "I'll admit it was amusing to see them arguing over me. So you're not even divorced and you're with your wife's sister?" Brad Jr. tried to sound serious. "Be quiet, Brad," Georgia yelled back at him. I didn't think he wanted to get too close to me. Amy and I chuckled again, and I could hear Darren and Tony giggling behind us, too. Hey, at least I waited until I found out that my clueless brother and my cheating ex-wife were together with family's support, I shot back. Oh, and Brad, just between us, you can keep Georgia. I think I picked the wrong sister the first time. Georgia is nothing compared to this little spark, I said, pulling Amy a little closer and looking into her eyes. Amy gazed back at me with a playful look. A moment later, I turned my focus back to my older brother. He had turned a bit red. I wasn't sure if it was from embarrassment, anger, or jealousy. But since he looked embarrassed, I thought I'd tease him a little more since they had come to see me. Hey, Brad, did you like my big move tonight? Did it feel a bit familiar? I grinned at him. Brad turned even redder this time, clearly embarrassed. I was shorter than him, but I was fit while he was out of shape. He looked at me, but knew he couldn't take me on. I laughed again and then turned back to my father. So, Brad, I said, getting back to the main topic and looking at Dad. Amy asked you a good question. What have I done that you think I should be forgiven for? Shouldn't it be the other way around? You walked out on us, you ungrateful jerk, he shot back, clearly angry. I think my teasing about his son had upset him. After everything we did for you, you just left. After everything you did for me, I replied, tilting my head to the side. After everything you did? I repeated, shocked, still trying to understand what he meant. My sister Joanna, who always had to speak her mind, jumped into the conversation. She seemed to have a knack for choosing the wrong side. Maybe that's why she struggled to keep a relationship. With her brown hair, you might think she had a few loose screws. Your job, you fool! Joanna exclaimed, her nose flaring. Mom and Dad got you a job right after high school, letting you study at the same time. Dad is saying you threw it back in their faces, that your little outburst is really hurtful. It was clear to everyone what my parents were trying to say, but I knew they didn't want to admit they felt betrayed or that they still thought it was okay to treat me the way they did. I turned to my parents. Brad, Hattie, I said softly. Both Mom and Dad looked at me. Thanks for the job after high school. They smiled back. But the university was a scholarship. I worked hard for that, and I never once let the quality of my work slip because of what others sponsored me for. Their smiles faded. I never let my martial arts training get in the way of work, and I never let the laziness or mistakes of my siblings hold me back. Can you say the same? Of course we can, my father replied, sounding defensive. Really? I shot back quickly, not giving him a chance to speak. So your family life is perfect and the business is booming without me. They had no answer. I didn't think so. I finished. I raised an eyebrow at Georgia. Under my stare, she stepped back a little. My parents looked at her, their cheeks turning red. Look, I sighed. Nothing has changed in a year. I asked all of you to leave me alone. I told you I want nothing to do with any of you, but you keep coming after me, acting like it's all my fault that you're unhappy. It's not my fault. You should be looking at yourselves. That's not fair, Robbie, Joanna said. It's not our fault your partner couldn't stay loyal. As soon as she said it, she covered her mouth, realizing her mistake. Finally, someone had said what I was thinking. Joanna looked at Georgia, who was turning red with embarrassment. No one else spoke. Everyone was stunned in silence for the first time. I'm sorry, Georgie, it just slipped out, Joanna said. Then she turned back to me, waving her hand at Georgia and glaring at me. See, if you had just followed the plan, I wouldn't be embarrassing my sister-in-law like that. I couldn't help but laugh, and I felt Amy giggling beside me. Look, as nice as it has been to see you, I said with a hint of sarcasm. I appreciate everyone cheering for me tonight, but unless you have something really important to say, we have a long drive home. Where are you living? My mother asked. Pretty far from all of you, I answered, maybe a bit too harshly. You're living with my sister, Georgia said, glaring at Amy. Sister? Amy replied cheerfully, making things more tense between them. Sorry, sis, but I've only been with one guy my whole life, and I'm sticking with him. You had your chance and missed it. All right, ladies, I said. Georgia, it's time to move on. I don't want anything to do with you again after what you did. For heaven's sake, the kid isn't even mine. Amy, I said. She looked at me with wide, adorable eyes. Calm down. Amy gave a little bark and smiled, giggling. If she had a tail, I bet she would be wagging it in joy. Everyone else, I said, turning to my family. You need to understand that I am not going back to Total Build. I don't want to see any of you or hear from you ever again if I can help it. But why? My mother asked, her voice almost begging. Do I really need to explain that after everything from the past year? Have you heard anything I've said? I replied. Come on, son, haven't you ever made a mistake? Dad said softly. Yes, many. But I take responsibility for them. When I mess up, I apologize and try to make things right. I don't just ignore the pain I caused, and believe me, I'm hurt. Robbie, we're sorry, Mom started, but Dad cut her off, grabbing her arm. Is that really how you feel? He asked. You still don't get it, do you? I said. You keep treating me badly, and you show no regret for what you've done. Yet you think I'm the problem. All of you are mistaken. Of course, this is how I feel. For a moment, everyone was silent. Dad just stared at me, thinking. Part of me hoped that maybe someone in the family would start to understand what I had been through. Okay, then, Dad finally said. We all turned to him. If you feel this way, then you're out of this family, Dad declared. Everyone gasped, including me. You think you're special because you're hurt, Dad continued. I could feel a lecture coming on. But let me tell you something, Robert. You are not special. You were an unwanted child who shouldn't have been born. Your only real purpose was for the company. You want to know why we never told you about Brad and Georgia? Because you didn't deserve to know. You've always thought you were better than us, so forget you, Robert. From what I gather, you haven't had a job since you left us. You've been living with some people who aren't doing well and with your wife's half-sister. No, Dad, my mother said softly, trying to calm my father down. But he kept going, not even noticing her. We gave you a year to get yourself together, my father shouted, anger showing in his voice. We came here tonight to make peace and let you come back to work, hoping you would take our thanks. But instead we find someone acting like they are better than everyone else and that we owe you an apology? You must be dreaming, kid. Brad Jr. was now grinning widely. Joanna looked worried, glancing between me and our father. I shrugged, but Dad was far from done. So you want to keep being disrespectful? Dad said. Fine, it's your choice. Tomorrow we'll go to a lawyer and take you out of our wills. We'll sue you for everything you have for causing problems with Total Build. You'll regret not accepting our forgiveness. For the rest of your life, you'll remember how we took everything from you, leaving you broke and paying us back for years, all because you wouldn't get your act together. Are you done? I asked, raising an eyebrow. I wasn't quite smiling, but I was close. Not even close, Dad shot back angrily. I will do everything I can to make sure you never get a good job again. Whenever I find out you have a job, I'll call and let them know what a loser you are. I'll work hard to keep you broke until you come begging us for forgiveness. But when that time comes, you'll learn that there is no forgiveness for you in this family anymore. You will end up with nothing and living on the streets. Wow, Dad, he sounds serious, Amy said, teasing him with a smirk. And don't act high and mighty, young lady, my father said, scolding her. If you're with him, you'll be in trouble too. I heard how you went for him the moment you could, you little troublemaker. Shame on you for wanting your sister's husband. Really? Amy replied, her smile even bigger. She pulled out her phone and started recording. Could you please say that again, oh great one? This way, Robbie and I can listen to this while we struggle on the streets thanks to your so-called righteous anger. My father glanced at her for a moment, then back at the phone. Everyone held their breath. From this day forward, my father declared in a serious tone, Robert Other is no longer part of this family. He will no longer share in its benefits and will be taken out of our wills. If he tries to come back, I won't let him. I own Total Build, and I plan to take Robert Other to court for the money we lost because he left at a crucial time. I will make sure that every possible employer and our suppliers know we welcomed him back. But he chose to leave. Our family will make sure that he and Robert will never have peace again. We will show them that they shouldn't mess with us. Is that clear, young lady? Absolutely, Amy said with a smile as she put her phone down. My father scoffed, and my family stared at him like he was being strange. My mom kept looking between my dad and me. I could tell she recognized that things were not going well this time. Do what you want, he said sharply to my girlfriend, who was smiling wide. My dad, if he noticed, did not respond to her cheerfulness. You're young, and good luck finding a lawyer as good as mine. Next year, you'll both wish you had never crossed paths with us, and you'll be left with nothing. He shot me one last angry look, and I matched it fiercely. At that moment, I realized we were alike. Both of us could be stubborn. I fought battles in the ring. My dad clung to his pride. Without saying more, Dad turned and walked out. Brad Jr. and Joanna glanced at me, shaking their heads, thinking I was the one in trouble. They surely believed I was in for it with the way Dad was acting. My mom and Georgia stood there, looking at Amy and me. In a moment, Georgia gave us a sad look and walked away, leaving my mom alone with me. You really had to push him, didn't you, Robbie? My mother looked worried, but not angry. I had never seen her look so torn. Maybe if you apologized. No, Hattie, I doubt that would change anything. I know I got my stubbornness from him. That's why I haven't forgiven any of you. Go, Hattie, follow your husband, but let me give you one piece of advice. She looked at me with concern. I took a breath, ready to respond to my father. Tell Brad that if he tries any of the things he just said, or if I hear him speaking badly about me, I will make sure to tear apart this entire family and business until there's nothing left but ruins. You don't have the money to do that, Mom said carefully. That doesn't matter, I interrupted, shaking my head. If he wants a fight, he'll get one. I held that place together for years despite all the mistakes. Just look at you, it's been only a year, and you have lost over a third of your business. You're about to lose half your team. Many items are coming back because they were badly made, and it seems like no one knows what to do without my help. If your husband really wants to fight, think about what you saw in the ring tonight. Think of the focus and strength I need to fight and win. Imagine what I would do in a real fight with my not-so-loving family if I brought my focus and what I know about all of you. Tell him, Hattie, to let it go. You know I'll be okay without any of you, but tell him to back off, or it will be all of you against me. My mother looked at me, and for the first time I saw sadness in her eyes. She knew it was true. If they came at me, it would be them who lost, not me. It won't help, Robbie, Mom sighed. He meant everything he said tonight. I've been trying to convince him all this time, but he won't listen. Tears started to fall down my mother's face. Robbie, your father said you weren't expected, and that is true, Mom whispered. But never think you were a mistake. I love you, my dear boy, and I'm sorry for what happened. We should never have kept Georgia and Brad's affair from you, or about the child. But I won't regret having my grandchild, even if it wasn't planned." Mum stopped talking, looking sad. She glanced at me like she wanted to say more, then looked at Amy. "Please take care of my son. He's all alone now, and he will need someone for the fight ahead." "Oh, I think we saw tonight that Robbie knows how to handle himself," Amy said with a bit of pride in her voice. My mother shook her head. "Not like this, he doesn't. His father will come at him like he said he would. He will try to hurt Robbie just to prove a point." For the first time, Tony spoke up. "Then stand up to your husband, Hattie," Tony said. "Tell him to back off. That's your son he's about to face." Mom shook her head again. "It won't matter." She looked at me. "I'm so sorry, Robbie. If I never see you again, please know that even if I can't say it, I will always love you. You were the heart of this family, and we tried to hurt you for no reason but our pride. You are the best of us. Never forget that. But do what you have to do." "For what it's worth." Mom paused and narrowed her eyes. "I don't think the rest of them stand a chance, but I have to back my husband." "I know, Mom," I replied sadly. She looked at me suddenly. It was the first time she had heard me call her Mom in over a year. She looked at me, then nodded slowly. "I will love you forever," Mom said, turning to walk back to her family. Before she could turn completely, I dashed the few steps between us and pulled her into a big hug. For almost 2 minutes we stood there not moving. I realized my mother was trapped, but I understood how she had to take care of her family, even if it meant putting one of us aside. Our hug might have lasted a little longer, but soon I heard my dad calling her name from far away. I let go of Mum. She turned to me, held my face in her hands, and kissed my cheek. "Goodbye, Robbie," she whispered softly. "Goodbye, Mum," I said quietly, both of us in tears as she walked away. The drive home after the fight was a mix of feelings. On one hand, I had won a fight that no one thought I would. I had friends with me, and the girl I liked was right there too. It made me happy to know she cared for me just as much. On the other hand, my family had pushed this whole situation. I hadn't really asked for it, but now it seemed like we would never get back to how things were. I also worried that my dad might do something rash and try to hurt me over the problems with Brad and Georgia. That thought made me feel down. I knew I was still angry with them. None of them saw their part in how they let me down. But until tonight, I thought there might one day be an apology. I took a deep breath. I was confused after everything that happened tonight. Though I hated to say it, I did miss them. Family is family. You can't really replace parents or siblings. And even if I didn't like them much, there was still a bit of love in my heart for them, even for my annoying brother. But my dad was ruining even those small feelings. I felt Amy watching me while I stared out the window as Darren drove faster onto the highway for the next part of our trip to Noosa. "Are you okay, babe?" Amy asked softly when the car was quiet for a while. "I think so," I replied, still lost in my thoughts. It's just been a long night. Fights and family are making everything so mixed up in my mind. Tony turned around from the front seat to look at me. "Robbie," she said, "you haven't done anything wrong. Georgia and your family took advantage of you being kind and hard-working. They thought you would always want the best for everyone, and when they got caught in their actions, they couldn't admit they were wrong." Tony glanced at Amy for a moment. "Georgia knows what she lost. She couldn't take her eyes off you while you and your dad argued earlier," Tony said with a smile. "Georgia looked at Amy a few times, and her expression changed. She realizes you will never see her in the same way again, but until tonight, your family kept encouraging her, making her think it was still possible. I think she would have left your brother without a second thought if she thought there was any chance that you might forgive her and take her back." I let out a small laugh. "See?" Tony said after watching my reaction. "Georgia knows she has lost you, but it really bothers her that she lost you to her younger sister." Amy chuckled. "Well, I lost my older sister to Robbie's older brother. I'd say it's a fair trade, but I think I came out on top." We all laughed, taking turns joking for the next 20 minutes. I felt Amy lean her head on my arm as we drove. Then, her arm wrapped around mine and she gave me a brief squeeze before letting out a happy sigh. At that moment, I understood that I loved Amy much more than I ever loved Georgia. Why? because of her actions. Amy stood up to my father for me tonight without hesitation. I felt like she would have pushed him if she could. Sure, as Tony said, Georgia was upset about losing me, but she never stood up to my family or said sorry during all the troubles we faced. The car grew quiet as we drove. As we traveled down the highway, I fell asleep, tired, on our way home. Home. Tonight, for the first time, I thought of Amy's place as home. I hadn't felt at home for over a year. Amy's place was lovely. Who wouldn't want to call a house overlooking the Pacific Ocean home? But as I drifted off with the streetlights from the highway flashing over my heavy eyes, I realized that home was more than just four walls and a roof. A home is about who you share it with. At Darren and Tony's, I was a guest. I had a room there, but it wasn't really my home. With Amy, over the past few months, she let me change things in the house to make it feel more comfortable. We talked about what we both wanted to do with the place, and together, we made those changes happen. A couple of hours later, we pulled into the driveway. I was sleeping lightly when the car stopped. Then I woke up to a gentle kiss on my lips. I barely remembered moving into the house, but the next morning I found Amy lying next to me. I woke up quietly, trying not to disturb her as I headed for the shower. I turned the water up hot and stepped under the spray, enjoying the warmth washing over me. My muscles felt tight after the fight, and I groaned when my right calf cramped up. It was a common issue, and I usually needed to sit down until it passed. But just before I could find a place to rest, a pair of arms wrapped around me. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Amy asked, looking worried. "I have a muscle cramp," I replied roughly. Amy helped me sit down in the shower. She joined me after a moment and wanted to know more about the cramp as she settled in front of me. Then, she gently took my leg and started to massage my calf. I let out a groan. Her touch was gentle yet firm, easing the tightness in my muscle while helping the blood flow. I looked closely at her. She had a serious look while concentrating on my leg. "Oh, no, I think you have another cramp," she said with a smile. "Is your leg feeling better now?" I nodded. "Good." She moved a bit closer, making sure both my legs were over hers. I felt her warmth against me as she leaned in. The water was still falling on us. She kissed me, pressing against my chest. "I love you, Robbie," she whispered as we paused to catch our breath. Her voice was filled with warmth and love. I felt proud to be with her. She let her hands roam to help me feel more relaxed as we shared gentle kisses. I felt overwhelmed with happiness. I let out a sound as I felt a wave of emotion, but Amy continued to hold me gently, making sure I felt good. When it was over, she sighed happily and looked at me with adoring eyes. "Feeling better, love?" she asked. "Yeah," I said, a bit spaced out, lost in her gaze. She kissed me once more before helping me stand up. We took turns cleaning each other off and shared sweet moments together. "I love you, Amy," I said just before we stepped out of the shower. In response, she pressed her wet body against me. "I know, Robbie. You're mine now, and I'm not letting you go," Amy said playfully. Once we dried off and headed downstairs, we found Darren and Tony already dressed and ready for breakfast. "For a guy who had a long night, you seem pretty relaxed this morning," Darren teased, a sly look on his face. Yeah," I replied, blushing. Darren, Tony, and Amy all laughed. We slipped on our shoes and put on our hats, ready to start the day. We walked down to the village and ended up at one of our favorite places, a small cafe called The Village. It was just right for a Sunday morning. The outdoor seats and tasty coffee made it a great spot. Sitting down for bacon and eggs was exactly what I needed. Darren was right. Last night had been tough with all the challenges we faced. Now that my training was less intense, I decided to order a big breakfast with everything. Darren did the same. Our meals had toast, bacon, eggs, mushrooms, grilled tomatoes, hash browns, beans, spinach, sausage, and an amazing potato rosti. The girls went for omelets, and I was surprised when the owner, Michael, came over and placed our meals on the table himself. I got a tall glass of fresh tropical juice and a big cappuccino. It was a busy morning. Normally, Michael would be busy cooking in the back while his wife, Marie, served the customers. But today, he came out to greet us and shook my hand. "Great fight last night, Mr. Other. Marie and I cheered for you all through it. That last move to take out Cody was something," he said, smiling. "Thanks, Michael." It was a tough match. Cody made it hard, I replied. We chatted for a few minutes, and I agreed to come back soon for a photo in my gear to go on his wall. Then he returned to the kitchen. With Amy proudly holding my hand beside me and Darren and Tony across the table, I noticed it was a lovely morning. We could hear the ocean waves in the background. As we took it all in together, I felt a sense of calm and happiness that I hadn't felt in a long time. Enjoying the morning, we began talking about the fight. "Has anyone heard how Cody is?" I asked. So much happened last night that I forgot to check on him. In the ring, nothing was personal. Even after tough talk, the winner would usually reach out to the loser in a few days to check on them. Darren chuckled a bit. "I got a message from the event managers while you were in the shower. Cody woke up this morning without remembering the last part of the fight. He has a bad headache and lots of bruises, so they are thinking about delaying his next match for another 6 weeks to let him heal." Darren looked at me with interest. "They mentioned that Cody's next opponent, Aaron Masters, doesn't want to fight him anymore. He's set on fighting you." "You mean Aaron wants to fight me?" I asked. Aaron had traveled the world for fights last year and won many more than he lost. He was favored to win against Cody, while I was seen as not likely to win against Cody. Darren nodded. "If you're interested in that fight, I wouldn't jump right in. You'd need to follow a specific training plan first." "But—" I brushed off the question. "No, even though I'm interested, last night was exciting, but it was very close. I don't want to push myself too hard right away," I said while sipping my coffee, thinking about how last night could affect my fighting future. We kept chatting. Darren showed me my moves and defense from a video he took on his phone. The girls listened in. At one point, Tony turned to Amy and asked, "So what did you think of the fight last night?" Darren's girlfriend asked mine, her brow raised, hinting it was a tricky question. "Which one? The one in the ring or the parking lot?" Amy said with a grin. We all laughed. "The one in the ring," Tony replied once our laughter faded. "They both went well for my guy, but the one in the ring was unforgettable," my girlfriend said, looking at me with happiness. "I watched Robbie prepare, and I'm so glad you both showed up to help. The way Robbie moved, he took those punches and just kept going. Even if he hadn't won, I would still be proud of him." She smiled brightly. I smiled back and kissed her. I also got a bunch of messages from my Alro team who were there. They loved it too. "Robbie will be popular with them," Amy told us, her hand still on my arm. Tony nodded wisely. "You know Georgia would never come to his fights?" "Yeah, I know. She used to complain to me about it, but I guess she finally saw how tough my man is last night." Amy replied with a grin, giving my arm a squeeze. We spent another half hour discussing my moves, how I kicked, how I took Cody's punches, and how I executed that final move. "So, Robbie," Darren said, shifting the topic. "What about the family situation? Have you thought about it?" I paused for a moment, remembering several talks Amy and I had about it over the past few months. I shrugged. "I don't know. My father's tone was serious. I'm guessing he's coming for me, but if he thinks I'll just give up without a fight, he's mistaken. I'll stand my ground if they come at me." "We will," Amy added firmly. "Sorry?" I asked her. "We will stand our ground together," my girlfriend repeated, stressing that we were in this as a team. "Robbie, I won't let you face this alone. You are my guy, and if they are brave enough to come after you, they will come after me too. After threatening you last night, your father also threatened me. I even have it recorded," she said with a smile, her eyes shining with determination. We spent the rest of our time discussing different scenarios. Then we walked back home together. The four of us changed into our beach clothes, grabbed some towels, and headed to the beach. For the next few hours, we took turns swimming and relaxing on the sand. Darren and I enjoyed riding the waves while the girls played and sunbathed. I haven't mentioned Tony yet. She is a few years older than me and keeps fit by working out with Darren a few times a week. She has a nice shape that always makes heads turn when she walks by. It makes Darren laugh, and Tony always smiles when that happens. Even though they aren't married, they have been together for over 15 years, starting in high school. Tony sometimes worried about not being able to have kids, but it never seemed to bother their relationship. I admired how loyal Darren has always been to Tony. Today, in her pale yellow bikini, Tony showed off her confidence. On the other hand, Amy had curves that caught a lot of attention. A few guys approached her, but she just pointed to me and told them I was her boyfriend. When one guy didn't take the hint, Amy asked if he had seen the fight last night. He said he hadn't, but had watched the highlights. Amy then pointed to me again, and I've never seen someone walk away so fast. After a few wonderful days with them, Darren and Tony headed back home. The next week arrived, and it was time for the final divorce hearing. Amy and I woke up in the morning and showered. While she made some work calls, I called George. He confirmed our meeting in the early afternoon and said he would be there. We chatted a little more, and I sighed when we hung up. "You okay, sweetheart?" Amy asked as she stepped onto the balcony. It had quickly become one of my favorite places to think. She was on a conference call with someone in Europe and one of her distributors. "Yeah, it's going to be an interesting afternoon," I said. Amy laughed. "Yes, it will be." Her call started, and she winked at me before jumping on for 15 minutes while we finished getting ready to drive down the coast. This time, we would be taking Amy's car, which was quite impressive. It was almost worth $200,000. She had an imported right-hand drive customized 2021 Shelby Mustang. It had a cool white color with blue racing stripes and a sporty rear spoiler. Of course, it had the famous black Shelby Cobra on the front. The first time I saw it, I was amazed. "Amy, what's this?" I asked. She smiled. "It's our car, baby," she said with a big smile. She let me drive to the court. Wow! When I pressed the gas, the car reacted quickly, unlike any car I had driven before. With over 900 horsepower under the hood, I felt nervous at first until I got used to it. After that, driving on the highway was a blast. When we walked into the courthouse for the final divorce meeting, I couldn't help but smile after that drive, even with what was happening. We met George, who shook our hands and grinned when I mentioned my ride in Eleanor, the name Amy gave her car. Yes, the movie Gone in 60 Seconds had a lot to do with that name, but it fit such a lovely car. George, Amy, and I entered the courtroom at the right time. A few minutes later, Georgia arrived, accompanied by my parents, Brad Jr., and 2 lawyers from my father's firm. My dad gave me a smirk, then chatted with the lawyers while pointing at me. They pointed at George, who smiled back politely. When they exchanged worried looks and whispered to my father, his smile faded a little. The meeting went through the usual steps. The magistrate read the divorce papers, talked about the money, and then granted the divorce. Georgia looked at me a few times, and I looked back. She kept glancing at Amy with a frown, while Amy just smiled in return. The judge finalized the divorce, commenting on how sad it was to see another marriage end because of cheating. He pointed out that Georgia was the one who had been unfaithful. She turned red, but the process had to continue. When he hit the gavel, it was over. After we left the courtroom, George, Amy, and I were chatting when one of George's lawyers approached us. "I'm sorry, Mr. Other," he said, looking right at me. "I tried to talk them out of it, but they were set on it," he said with a worried glance at George. I nodded and offered my hand. "Mr. Robbie Other, you've been served." He handed me a big manila envelope, then tried to step back politely. I passed the envelope to George, who smiled. We had thought my family might try something like this. "Thank you, Randy. I'll make sure this gets handled properly," George said kindly to my father's lawyer. Randy looked worried. "You mean you're going to—" "Never mind," he said, quickly walking away, shaking his head. We watched as Randy went back to my dad. Dad lost his smile again when Randy explained more about who George was. George was well known in Australia as a top lawyer. He had been offered a high-ranking role 5 times, but had turned it down to stay with his successful law firm. He had helped Amy's growing business early on, thanks to a great recommendation. When George met Amy and saw how promising her work was, he decided to invest money with her and has been by her side ever since. As her lawyer, he became my lawyer too. Don't tell anyone, but George is a really nice guy, I thought as I noticed his smile towards Randy and my father. It wasn't a friendly smile. It looked more like a hunter watching its next meal. "You kids can go now. This is all in my hands," George said, opening an envelope and looking through its papers. He raised an eyebrow and then glanced over at Randy, who looked down in shame. Outside the courthouse, Amy and I headed to her car. Just before we reached it, I heard my mother's voice calling out, "Robbie, wait!" My mom said as she hurried towards us. My dad was walking slowly behind her. We need to stop meeting like this, I joked as I faced them. I noticed Brad Jr. and Georgia getting into his Lexus. Georgia gave me a sad look before getting in, and they drove away. What do you want? I asked my mom and dad. It was hard for me to see him as my father anymore. Robbie, Mom said, trying to sound like she really wanted to talk. I spoke with your father and he's ready to drop the lawsuit if you just talk to us. I raised an eyebrow at her, ignoring my dad. I could see that my mom was struggling and trying to make peace, which was hard for her. Is that all? I asked. And you need to apologize to us. Then you can come back to work at Total Build for half pay for 3 years. Oh, and you won't get any bonuses, so you can pay back what you owe us, my dad added, resting his hands on my mom's shoulders. I noticed her uncomfortable expression when he touched her. I laughed. Goodbye, Brad, Hattie. I've given your silly lawsuit to my lawyer. We made our feelings clear last time. You declared war, Brad. Today, you backed that up. I don't see us as family anymore, and I don't think we'll ever be on good terms again. I don't owe you an apology, and I doubt you feel sorry for being such a jerk. I turned to face them, crossing my arms as I watched my dad get angry. I couldn't help but smile. You want to fight, Brad? You've got it, dear father. Now, unless you have anything else to say, my girlfriend and I have plans. See you in court. With that, I took Amy's hand and walked to her Mustang. If I had looked back, I would have seen my mom trying to pull away from my dad while he frowned. His frown grew deeper when we didn't walk around the car, but opened it, started it up, and drove off, leaving tire marks on the ground. The next 3 months were some of the happiest times of my life. I was away from my family when Amy fulfilled her promise to take me with her abroad. Thanks to Alro, we had a wonderful trip. We flew in business class, stayed in fancy hotels, rode in private cars, and enjoyed great meals in different countries. Every few days, Amy would meet with various people. Sometimes they were her employees. Most of the time, she was talking with companies that Alro was investing in. I got to attend a few of those meetings as a guest. I was amazed and proud to see that my girlfriend was very capable. The night before meetings, she would read through papers, send emails to gather information, and then be ready to discuss important topics with people much older than her. In one meeting, Mr. Craig Eli, a new CEO for the company we were visiting, acted like he didn't think a young woman should have any authority. After he made critical comments about Amy's ideas for the second time, I was really upset. Amy hadn't said anything wrong. Looking around the table, everyone seemed tense, but Amy didn't look embarrassed. She looked strong, focused, and ready. After he interrupted for the third time, claiming Amy didn't understand their business, she switched the topic, asking him about how the company recognized revenue on their balance sheet. His face showed he was not happy. Before he could respond angrily, Amy raised her hand, quieting everyone. With calm confidence, she turned to the chairman and the CFO, who were both seated at the other end of the table. They looked worried, knowing Amy was the head of Alro and that Alro had invested a lot of money in their company. As Amy stood up, I stood with her, and the local Alro manager, Margaret, did too. I'm sorry, everyone, Amy began, looking at the chairman and CFO, but this meeting has to end now. I came here to learn about Alro's future with this company. Instead, I have been talked down to by your leader. Before this meeting, I heard from Margaret about 3 complaints regarding Mr. Craig Eli's behavior, and now I understand why. That's nice, Craig Eli said, clearing his throat and sounding proud. But I have 30 years of experience. I know how to run a company. Amy replied with a smile. Mr. Eli, 30 years of experience sounds great. However, let's take a look at your results, shall we? She paused for a moment. This wasn't the cheerful woman who had helped me when my family hurt me. This was a strong CEO who could see through the lies. Standing firm and looking directly at Craig Eli, Amy opened a folder in front of her. Out of the 5 companies you've worked with in the past 10 years, 3 have let you go quietly. 1 didn't renew your contract, and I bet if we looked harder, we'd find similar issues at the others. You have a pattern of choosing quick wins over long-term success, and staff morale is usually low when you leave, she explained. I was amazed at how confident and clear Amy was. Craig Eli fumbled for words as she kept pressing on. You're on your 4th marriage. Your last two ended because you were unfaithful to your wives. Your current wife knows you're being unfaithful and is ready to take action very soon." Craig Eli lost color at the mention of his wife and his mistakes. The room fell quiet, waiting for Amy's next statement. "Mr. Eli, I may not have 30 years of experience like you do, but I have a great team all over the world, and they provide me with all the information I need. Alro invests hundreds of millions of dollars each year in many different fields. As the founder and CEO of Alro, it's my job to speak up when I see issues." She reached out her hand, and Margaret placed some papers in it. "I have documents here that say Alro will stop its financial support in 5 business days unless Mr. Eli is removed from the CEO position. Alro also sees Mr. Eli's ongoing role here as a risky investment and will act accordingly." She then turned to the rest of the group. "I'm officially saying that I doubt Mr. Eli's claims about his leadership. You have an emergency board meeting set for 6 this evening to discuss this. Margaret will be there, as usual, in ARO's board seat, and I think you know how she will vote." With that, Amy shut the folder and walked out of the room, with Margaret and me following closely behind. We stayed quiet in the elevator on the way down. Amy was all business until the car arrived to take us out for a late lunch. After we said goodbye to Margaret, once we were back in the car, Amy let out a long breath and ran her hands through her dark hair. "How did I do?" she asked, glancing at me with a bit of worry in her eyes. "You were amazing," I replied, completely impressed with my girlfriend. "You really took that guy apart. I'm so proud of you." Amy looked out the window at the scenery passing by, but then she slipped her hand into mine. "I knew we had to get rid of him, but I wanted to give him a fair chance. Many people underestimate me because I'm young and a woman, but I had to be smart and spot problems quickly or Alro wouldn't be here today." "You really did great, my love. I hope I can always be here for you," I said, sharing how I truly felt. Amy looked surprised for a moment. Then I realized I had called her my love for the first time. Her eyes lit up and she leaned closer, giving me a soft kiss in the back seat of the car. "You love me?" she asked, forgetting all about work. I chuckled as the driver continued on. "Of course," I said, kissing her again. "Then take me back to the hotel and show me how much," Amy replied, her hand gently brushing my arm. We enjoyed the afternoon by the hotel pool and spent some intimate time together in our room. Later that evening, Amy learned that Craig Eli had been let go from his job, and we prepared to leave for our next destination the following day. We spent 2 weeks in the United States. Half of that time was for work, and the other half was for sightseeing. But when we landed in Europe, everything slowed down for us. Amy mentioned that she wanted a vacation, and since I was with her, it was a great chance to see the places we had talked about during our first date. We went on adventures, exploring Germany, Italy, London, Ireland, and France. We made special memories everywhere we went. We even visited a clothing-optional beach. I admit, I felt a little jealous seeing some guys checking out Amy, who looked amazing. But Amy also noticed some women looking my way, admiring my fit body. We did this to check it off our list of experiences. It was fun, but now we felt it was something we both didn't want to repeat, knowing we belonged to each other. While we were enjoying tea in London, we got a message from George. He told us that Total Build was still threatening to sue. The first meeting had not gone well for them. The judge made it clear that they were suing me and even asked my parents some questions about their actions against their own son. My dad's lawyer argued that I had broken my work contract, which hurt the company's profits and quality. George explained that I had resigned and contacted Fair Work Australia to make sure I received the benefits and bonuses I was owed. Then, for reasons I didn't understand, my father told the court that I was recently divorced and separated from the family. When the judge asked why, my dad, despite his lawyer's warning, shared his opinion. He needs to get his head unstuck. George tried to stifle his laughter as he shared this with us. Just because his brother has a baby with his ex-wife doesn't mean he can ignore the family business. That got the judge's interest. Further questions showed that the whole family kept secrets from me until I found my brother, the sales manager for Total Build, in a compromising situation with my wife. The judge advised my parents to drop the case. He told them that not only would it likely fail in court, but they might also face trouble for taking their son to court unfairly. A date has been set for 6 months from now. In Ireland, we enjoyed drinking Guinness. We spent a lot of our time in pubs, relaxing with friends. When we got to France, the romantic side came out in both of us. We visited the Louvre, toured Notre Dame, shopped on the Champs-Élysées, took pictures kissing under the Arc de Triomphe, and got engaged on the Eiffel Tower. Yes, engaged. On the day we arrived in Paris, Amy had to attend one of her meetings alone. I told her not to worry while I wandered the streets and found a cafe to wait for her. When she arrived, I had a glass of wine and some cheese ready. Before that, I had gone to a local jewelry store to buy a simple engagement ring. It had a small diamond on a plain gold band. It was nice, but not too expensive. That night, we had dinner at the Eiffel Tower. After our main course, we stepped out onto the balcony to enjoy the view of Paris before dessert. That's when I got down on one knee. "Amy," I said, pulling the ring box from my coat pocket. "These last few months have been incredible. I never knew someone could give so much love without thinking of themselves. Because of you, I have moved past my anger and sadness. You lifted me from a dark place I didn't even know I was in. Every day since then, I have woken up hoping it wasn't just a dream to find you beside me. The happiness I feel when I see you makes me realize that if this is a dream, it's the best one I've ever had, and I never want to wake up." I opened the ring box and held it out. Amy's smile was nearly as bright as the lights above us on the tower. "Amy Brown, I want to share my life with you and face every moment together. Will you marry me?" Amy blushed with joy. She teared up. "Yes!" Amy shouted, and everyone around us laughed and cheered. I gently put the ring on her finger as she beamed with happiness. The next day, we took our time and stayed in bed. Amy was excited to enjoy every moment together. When we left, she proudly wore her engagement ring, letting everyone know she was engaged to Robbie Other. But all good times must come to an end. With a bit of sadness, we boarded the plane back home to Australia. In some ways, it felt nice to be back. Amy didn't have any travel plans for the next few months since she had done a lot of traveling during our vacation. A couple of days after we got home, I brought up the subject of getting a job. Living with Amy was great, but my savings were running low. I was slowly using up my funds, and I felt a sense of pride knowing I was going to get married again. When I mentioned it to Amy, she smiled widely. "Honey," Amy said with a playful look, "these last few months with you have been wonderful. Even in the few meetings you joined me, you were my support, and even when you weren't there, I felt good knowing I would come back to you, but," she added. I raised my eyebrow, curious about what she would say next. "You're right that you need to find a job. I know you have experience in construction and how to make a business successful. What if you started your own construction company?" Amy suggested, her innocent look making me think there was more to it. I smiled, considering her idea. It would be an interesting challenge for me. "You're right, love," I said. "I know construction, but if you think I should take on Total Build, I'm not sure I have enough money to compete with them. Plus, I've always worked in operations, not with the actual construction teams," I explained. "That's not true, Robbie. You're marrying the CEO of Alro," my fiancé said with a grin. "I'm sure we can find a way to raise some funds." "Alro Homes?" I asked, and Amy laughed at the name. "If that's what you want, my love," she replied. In the following month, I worked on a business plan, an operational guide, a financial plan, and a hiring strategy. Amy helped me with all the details. We planned to start our business in Queensland and then expand to other states as we grew. I was excited to return to the construction field, but in a different way than before. Amy and I did some research and found that while small homes were popular, there was a big market for container homes. Yes, homes made from shipping containers. We would create homes using these containers. At the start, we planned to offer 3 models: a small self-contained unit with a bathroom, kitchenette, and a combined bedroom living area, a modest model made from 4 containers that could be arranged in different ways, and a 2-story model made from 10 containers. All our homes would be modular and ready to be placed at the client's chosen location. The containers could be made with different materials, and they were very well insulated. Thanks to Amy's connections, We already had 4 big clients ready to work with us by the time we started. This included a large caravan park chain. It was surprising that with Alro's support, I got access to clients we had never reached when I was with Total Build. It took us almost 4 months to prepare everything. One day, when Amy saw me working at her kitchen table, she cleared some space in her office for me. She said she wanted me to work beside her. I made sure to present the full business plan to the Alro board. I didn't want to depend only on my connection with Amy. Sure, she helped me get in, but I wanted everyone to believe that this business would be successful. With the money from Alro, we rented a medium-sized warehouse. I hired 3 teams, a couple of office workers, 2 account managers, a marketing expert, and we were ready to go. In our free time, Amy and I started planning our wedding. Amy wanted to get married on the beach at sunset. I liked that idea and suggested we do it near her parents' home. When we talked about the details, we realized it would help keep a lot of people from breaking the Arlo privacy agreement because it was close by. Amy thought that was a great plan. Amy's parents, Rain and Peter, were happy for us at first, but were a bit unsure about Amy and me being together. However, they quickly got excited about our upcoming wedding after we returned from our trip abroad. We showed them some photos of us and a video taken by one of the staff at the Eiffel Tower when I proposed. After that, I felt like part of the family again. Through Rain, we learned that Brad and Georgia had gotten married and that Georgia was expecting her second child. As she told us this, I noticed that Rain seemed a bit sad, as if she was embarrassed to share the news. "Is she sure it's Brad's?" Amy asked, sounding a bit judgmental. Peter and I exchanged looks and quietly chuckled. I knew that Peter loved his older stepdaughter, Ruth, but he always had a rocky relationship with Georgia. Now, though, he was doing his best to avoid her. Rain looked at Amy and then turned away. "Amy," her mother replied softly, "that's a more serious question than you might think." I nearly choked on my drink. "What?" I said, surprised. "I'm sorry, Robbie," Rain said, looking at me with concern. "Things in your old family are not going well. It's been said that after you left Total Build, many of your clients left too. Total Build is struggling. When some of those clients found out why you had left..." For a moment, no one spoke as we absorbed this news. "Oh," I said, feeling shocked. "Oh," I exclaimed again as I realized what this all meant. Clients were starting to connect the dots. I walked away, and my ex-wife had a baby with my brother. Amy looked at me as we sat together, trying to see how I felt. I smiled at her, and she returned the smile. "Well, it couldn't happen to a nicer group of people," I said carefully. I wanted to be polite, but I couldn't help but make a little jab. "Georgia is still Rain's daughter and has her grandchild." Rain sighed and gave me a sad smile. She was one of the few who understood my feelings, along with Amy and Tony. At first, she didn't get why Georgia hurt me. If it weren't for the grandchild, I wondered if she would even talk to Georgia now. "Over the past 6 months," Rain began a bit nervously, "it came out that Georgia and your brother have been hanging around some not-so-good people. They go to parties and leave with different people than they came with." She turned bright red, talking about her daughter. I glanced at Peter, and he nodded, looking a bit embarrassed, too. Amy laughed, unfazed by the awkwardness. "So my sister, who makes poor choices, married a lazy guy, joined a club for swinging, and now she's pregnant. It could be from someone who's not even her husband?" "Amy, I know you don't like her, but Georgia is still your sister," Rain said firmly. Then her mood changed. "Georgia hopes the baby is Brad's, but she did tell me it could be from one of 3 different men," Rain added quietly. I stayed silent, sipping my drink, a Kraken and Coke. Peter always made sure I had what I needed. For a moment, I looked at my former mother-in-law. It hit me again that I might be in that role again soon. When I married Georgia, it felt like I gained another mother. After I found out what happened, she was too embarrassed to speak to me for weeks. My family seemed to know everything, but the Brown family had no idea. Once she got over the shock, she became someone who understood what I was going through instead of just feeling ashamed. "Why are you telling us this, Rain?" I asked my soon-to-be mother-in-law again. She shrugged and sank back into her chair, looking upset. "Because it's just that—" Rain buried her head in her hands and started to cry. Just then, a new voice joined in. "Because you're a good man, Robbie, and my sister did you wrong. On top of that, your family didn't treat you well either." Amy's older half-sister Ruth stood in the doorway. She had a pizza and a bottle of wine. "You may not want to hear it, but Mum feels you should know how bad things have gotten. Mum, can I share more with him?" Ruth came in and placed the pizza down in front of us. Peter quickly got up and went to the kitchen to grab a wine glass for Ruth. He also brought back a bottle of Kraken and a bottle of Coke for Amy, himself, and me to keep our drinks refilled. Rain looked at each of us. Then, with tears in her eyes, she glanced at me and nodded, showing she understood her oldest daughter's feelings. "All right," Ruth said with a big smile at Amy and me. "Before we move on, can I get a hug from my favorite brother-in-law and my soon-to-be favorite sister?" Feeling happy for the light moment, we both stood up and hugged Ruth. She admired Amy's engagement ring and asked us to share the story of the proposal while we enjoyed our pizza. Ruth was tall and slim like Georgia, with almost white blonde hair. She had 2 kids with her husband, Dave Masters. They got married while still in college after dating all through high school. Dave and Ruth were very loyal to each other, but they often argued. I remember one time at a family gathering when Georgia and I were just dating. I watched as they had a loud fight, both walking away in different directions. Later, they returned, apologized to each other and the family, and sat next to me. I was curious, so I asked about their fight. Ruth shrugged and told me that even though she was upset with Georgia, she could never imagine being with anyone else but Dave. She said it was okay to disagree on things and still be great together. I looked at Dave, and I could see that his earlier anger had disappeared, replaced by warmth as he agreed with her. Coming back to the present, I shook my head. "So, what happened next?" I asked after we settled back down and continued eating our pizza. Rain looked at Ruth and nodded again, happy not to have to tell the story herself. "I've heard bits of this from both Mom and Georgia," Ruth began. "First off, Robbie, I don't support what your family did at all. I have to disagree with Georgia's actions, and I am so proud of you that you handled it so calmly." Ruth looked down into her wine glass with a sigh, then raised her eyes to meet mine. "But Georgia is still my sister, so even though I'm upset with her, I still talk to her a bit because she doesn't have many people left who will listen." "See," Ruth continued, "I was just about 4 when my dad left my mom. I don't have many clear memories of that time, but I still feel a deep sadness. I remember the hurt from him cheating on my mom and walking away, so seeing my sister carelessly break her wedding vows was painful for me." She took another sip of her wine, and Rain looked sad, lost in her thoughts for a moment. "From what I know," Ruth told everyone gathered, "Brad had been trying to get Georgia to go to one of his parties for several months. Usually, to get an invitation, you need to be part of a couple, so even though she said no, he didn't get to go. When the news got back to her that you left the country with Amy, she cried and then gave in to what he wanted. She told me it felt like all her hope was gone and nothing mattered to her anymore." "Why?" I asked, more to myself than to anyone else. "Georgia is the one who cheated on me and had another man's child?" Ruth nodded. Rain looked like she lost her favorite pet, and Amy seemed a bit angry. "Georgia thought you would forgive her and take her back," Ruth said as she took another bite of pizza. "But when she heard you had flown away with her younger sister, she broke down. She gave in to Brad, and now they have been hanging out together at those parties until she ended up expecting a baby." Ruth looked at me, thinking more about it. I knew there was more to this story, but it was my turn to speak. I sighed, making eye contact with Ruth. "I have to admit that a part of me feels a bit glad seeing her so hurt, but I don't see why I need to know all this. Georgia is my past and Amy is my future. I know none of you would want to put me in a situation where I'd have to see her, so why do I need to hear this?" I glanced over at Amy, who seemed to think the same thing. She hadn't talked to Georgia at all and wasn't aware of any of this. Ruth sighed again and looked at her mother for help. Rain nodded gently. "It's because one of the possible fathers might be your sister's fiancé," Rain said softly. I nearly spit out my drink. "What?" I nearly shouted, then said, "Sorry." I glanced at Amy, who was just as shocked. Ruth and Rain both nodded. "Joanna's fiancé was with Georgia?" I asked, stunned. "Sorry for the language." Then a strange grin crept on my face as I realized what this meant. "Is it Chris? That guy she dated before I lost contact?" Chris was one of the workers at Total Build. He had shown interest in Georgia a few years back, but nothing happened. Then he started dating Joanna, and they had a rocky relationship. Yeah, Ruth said softly, looking down into her glass. It seems it was Chris talking with Brad that gave your brother the idea. Georgia told me Chris always liked her when you were together. Once he found out you two were done, he encouraged Brad to explore other options, thinking he could be with Georgia. Now he might be a father. And how is my sister holding up? I asked, trying hard to keep a straight face. Not very well, Rain stepped in, giving Ruth a break now that the topic wasn't about her daughter anymore. Joanna joined in on the parties, but when she found out that her fiancé might have gotten her sister-in-law pregnant, she became very upset with Chris, Brad, and Georgia. Right then, everyone was hoping the baby belonged to Brad. Ruth took a sip of her wine and looked at me. Come on, Ruth, spill it, Amy said, glancing at her sister. I can tell you have more news to share. Ruth smiled, though it wasn't a cheerful smile. This is kind of poetic, and Robbie, I think you'll find it funny, Ruth said. When Georgia first found out she was pregnant and realized it might not be Brad's, they went to talk to your parents. It took me a moment, but I figured it out. No way, I said as a smile formed on my face. Yep, they did, Ruth confirmed. I started laughing. Amy stared at me curiously as I laughed hard, slapping my knees even though the news was serious. What? Amy asked, confused. I looked at Ruth, who was now smiling, then at Rain, who seemed lost. Finally, Peter smiled at me, showing that he understood. I turned back to Amy. My parents told Georgia and Brad to keep it a secret from Joanna, I said, looking back at Ruth. Amy's eyes widened. No. She looked at her sister. They really did? Yes, Ruth replied. About 3 days after the pregnancy news, Chris began to wonder about the timing, and it all came out during a family gathering. Joanna went off on Georgia, calling her all sorts of names, and yelled at your parents for trying to hide it from Chris and her. I was chuckling now. Ruth held up her hands to quiet us as we were all about to burst out laughing again. I only have Georgia's side of the story, Ruth told us. As her older sister, she has called me a few times for support. She's feeling troubled and upset. Brad still wants them to join the swinger parties, and Georgia feels confused and hurt for the first time. I snorted. It's funny when the roles are switched. I paused. I'm sorry, Ruth. Rain, if I seem a bit cold. They both nodded, saying it was fine. I switched topics. So what about my parents? I asked. I'm not sure, Ruth answered, leaning back on the couch. Georgia hasn't told me much, but they told her and Brad that things would settle down eventually. They believe Joanna will get over it since she also went to the parties and had other partners. I suddenly wondered, so what about Joanna and Brad? Ruth chuckled. Georgia told me that one time when it was drawing partners, they looked at each other and laughed before picking again. Georgia mentioned she was a bit worried but didn't explain more. I shook my head. How did I not see that I was caught up in such a messy family? Because you're a good man, Peter said without missing a beat. Rain, Ruth, and Amy all nodded in agreement. That evening, the 5 of us talked about what was wrong with Georgia and my family. Then we switched to happier subjects, discussing my upcoming wedding to Amy and the wonderful trip we took together around the world. We carefully avoided getting too deep into the topic of ALRO. By this time, Amy's family had learned to accept that her job was a bit of a mystery. Later, Ruth asked me to walk her to her car after we hugged everyone goodbye. I gladly went with her. When we reached her car, she turned to me, hugged me again, and looked at me like a caring big sister, something Joanna had never done. You look happy again, Robbie, Ruth said with a smile. I shrugged and smiled back. I am. She laughed softly. Are you working again? I nodded, but before I could answer, she raised her hand. I'm guessing you're doing something with Amy since you're not sharing many details. I thought for a moment. Indirectly, yes. But yes, I am doing something I enjoy. Good. You deserve to be happy after everything they put you through. But Robbie? I looked at Ruth. While I know the kind of man you are, I also know the kind of person my youngest sister is. She thinks the world of you, always has, but if you ever... I raised my hand to stop her. I would never hurt myself first, I assured her. Ruth smiled at me. I know, Robbie, and that's why I care for you. I just needed to say it. With Georgia, I never spoke up, but with Amy. I understand, Ruth. I do. Amy means everything to me. I thought I would carry the pain of what Georgia and my family did to me forever. But Amy, I paused, collecting my thoughts. She saved me, Ruth, I said, feeling a tear in my eye. I've never told anyone but Amy this, I continued, looking into the night. But I was just pretending to be okay while I lived with Darren and Tony. I was often drunk or training, feeling really low. I even thought about giving up a few times. Ruth gasped, shocked. But when Amy showed up with Joanna, everything changed. She saved me, I explained. Once she brought me out of that dark place, I stopped thinking about hurting myself. Now all I want is to be with Amy. I could never hurt her. She's my hero, Ruth. You say she thinks the world of me, but I feel the same way. I know she is nothing like Georgia. Ruth hugged me tightly, wiping away a tear from her own eye. Just then, I felt arms wrap around me and a kiss on the back of my neck. It was Amy. I smiled brightly. "Good night, you two," Ruth said as she climbed into her car, smiling at us. Amy moved closer until my arm rested comfortably around her shoulder. We waved goodbye as she drove away. A couple of months later, I found myself in a familiar room on the morning of our wedding. I was back at Darren and Tony's house while Amy was at her parents' place. The day started off bright, with only a few clouds in the sky, and it didn't look like it would rain. I woke up late, and Darren took me out for breakfast. We were pretty relaxed until noon, when we all took showers and got ready. George joined us for a light lunch, and then we put on our clothes for the photographer, who was coming to take some pictures of us guys before the ceremony. Darren was my best man, and George was a groomsman. After the photographer arrived, Tony said her goodbyes and headed over to Rain and Peter's house to get ready as a bridesmaid, along with Ruth. We took some photos and spent another hour relaxing while watching a few professional fights. This included Cody's latest match in the United States, where he just managed to win. Later, we made our way down to the beach for the ceremony, and I was amazed at what the event team we hired had done. The small area of beach we had chosen had been beautifully arranged. They set up a raised pavilion for the ceremony, and the pillars were wrapped with ivy and various flowers from the gardens near the Gold Coast, making it look lovely. There were around 100 chairs set up on a special carpet that let sand through but was sturdy enough for women in heels to walk on. A rich ocean blue carpet led up the center aisle from the parking lot where Amy would arrive to the altar. In the background, the waves quietly washed against the shore as the tide slowly went out, marking a beautiful scene as sunset approached. For the first time, I felt nervous. Darren must have noticed. "You okay there, Robbie?" he asked with a smile. "Yeah, just feeling a bit nervous, that's all," I replied, trying to smile back. As guests began to arrive, I pushed my nerves aside and started greeting everyone. It was a diverse group of people. Our staff from A.L. Rowe and Al Rowe Homes came, bringing their partners, adding up to around 60 folks. This included some of Amy's staff from overseas that she had invited. I vaguely recognized a few of the Browns' extended family from my wedding to Georgia. Surprisingly, the Gold Coast mayor and a state government representative also showed up since they had been involved with ALRO for a while. I had met the mayor a few times through Total Build. We chatted about my changes, but he had a warm smile when he thought about my marriage to Amy and our work together at ALRO. By the way, I've always been curious. What does ALRO stand for? The state representative asked while we talked. I smiled. It took me months to finally get that answer from Amy. We were almost a month into our trip abroad before she told me. I leaned towards the mayor and spoke quietly, almost like we were sharing a secret. "Amy loves Robbie too," I said, then sat back. For a moment, the mayor just stared at me. I kept a big smile on my face. "Are you serious? All these years?" he asked, a curious grin on his face. I nodded. As new guests arrived, he took his wife's hand, shook his head, and laughed. About half an hour before sunset, a limousine pulled up. I held my breath as Rain quickly got out. She rushed to the special seat for the bride's mother at the front. As she passed me, she kissed my cheek and smiled widely before sitting down. I looked up and saw Amy standing at the top of the stairs. Her father, Peter, held her arm and smiled brightly, ready to give away his only child. Amy took my breath away. I think every groom feels something special when they see the woman they are about to marry. A part of me felt guilty thinking back to my marriage with Georgia, knowing I felt something similar then. But with Amy, we had gone through happy and sad times together, which made my feelings even stronger. With Amy, I knew she genuinely wanted me for who I am, not just what I could provide. Georgia was lovely, and I know she cared for me when we first started dating. But I realized we were caught up in excitement before truly loving each other. Because of my family background, I sometimes wondered if fate had brought us together. I see now that my marriage to Georgia lacked trust and friendship. The music began, and Ruth and Tony walked down the aisle before Peter and my bride. Amy was stunning. Her simple white strapless satin dress flared out at her hips, and the train flowed almost 6 feet behind her. It draped over her face and fell just to her nose. She wore deep red lipstick, and I noticed a touch of blue eyeshadow that matched the carpet beneath her. The minister spoke, but I barely heard him. I was too awestruck to focus on anything but her. We somehow managed to exchange our vows while gazing at each other. I was filled with excitement. My heart raced. I was marrying my business partner, my inspiration, and most importantly, my best friend. As the service went on, we looked at each other. In the background, we heard the minister ask if anyone objected to our marriage, prompting them to speak now or forever stay silent. Normally, there's a brief pause, a few knowing smiles, and then a collective sigh of relief as the ceremony continues. As Amy and I looked into each other's eyes, we didn't notice the group that had come in partway through our vows. "I object," a voice called out from the back of the crowd gathered around us. Most of the crowd were just people passing by, curious about a wedding on the beach. But in the middle of that crowd stood a group that would not leave me alone. At the front was a pregnant woman. She was Amy's half-sister and my ex-wife, Georgia. Georgia walked forward, followed by a young boy, my parents, and a few others. If I looked closely, I could see Joanna and her fiancé, Chris, in the background. The minister, a friendly local pastor named Gordon, cleared his throat. "On what grounds do you object?" He was a nice guy. Amy and I had met him a few times before. I could tell he wasn't used to objections at weddings just by the look on his face. Georgia looked at me, her face full of pain. "Because it's wrong. He's my husband. He can't marry my sister." Amy and I glanced at each other, our eyebrows raised, followed by a smirk as whispers spread through the crowd. Amy nodded to me, giving her support. "Georgia," I said, turning to my ex-wife but still holding on to Amy's hand, "we have been divorced for a year now and separated for almost 2 years." I knew this would get a response, so I let her set herself up. "That doesn't matter, my love," Georgia whined, sounding desperate. "You're mine, and you always will be. I've put up with you being with her for a year, but you need to come back to me." I saw Brad stiffen and my parents lose a bit of color. Amy and I shared a laugh. The audience murmured as they began to understand the situation. I looked at Amy again. She gave me a playful smile and a small nod. I thought, why not entertain them a bit more? I took a deep breath. "I stopped being yours the night I came home to find my brother with you in our bed." The crowd fell silent in shock. "I stopped being yours when I heard the two of you insulting me while you were together, saying you would make me think the baby inside you was mine when you knew it wasn't." There were worried whispers in the audience now, and my family looked uneasy. "I stopped being yours when I learned my family had been hiding your affair from me for 3 years." I said it with sharp words, and Georgia took a step back, her confidence fading. My family suddenly seemed unsure of themselves. The whispers grew louder, but it was still so quiet you could hear a pin drop. "I can't be with you because you married my brother after I left you for being unfaithful," I heard Georgia say. More glances were exchanged. "And let's not forget that the baby you are expecting is probably from my sister's fiancé, not even your current husband." The whispers stopped, and the room went silent again. Georgia looked pale. "No, Georgia," I said, continuing to speak. "No, my family, you cannot object to my marriage to a wonderful woman who helped me feel better after being hurt by those I trusted. None of you has a right to stand against me loving someone who has given me everything. She saved her love for me and only me, never having been with anyone else." I turned to Amy and shared a loving glance. She smiled back at me. Then I faced Georgia again, who was now crying. My parents were also there. My mother had tears in her eyes. My father remained calm, and my brother looked red in the face. I quickly glanced at Rain. She was staring at Georgia, her expression sad, which seemed to be her usual reaction when my ex-wife was mentioned. None of you have the right to object to my marriage with Amy, and none of you were invited today. The hurt you caused affects us all, and I hate that I had to speak about our family troubles here today. But when will you understand that I want nothing to do with any of you? I finished firmly. We all looked at them. Amy turned back to George, who nodded and stepped down from his place as my groomsman. I was worried something like this might happen, so I asked George to prepare for it. Amy whispered to me. Brad Other, Hattie Other, Brad Other Jr., Georgia Other, Joanna Other, George announced clearly. I have here a restraining order stating that you must stay at least 100 meters away from Mr. Robert Other and the new Mrs. Amy Other for the next 2 years. Breaking this order will lead to your arrest. Amy nodded at her mother, who then walked over to Georgia. They talked quietly for a moment, and then George and Rain helped the 4 of them leave. I noticed Joanna and Chris had already left. It took about 15 more minutes to get back to the ceremony. During that time, Amy never let go of my hands. Gordon cleared his throat. Now, with no more objections? He looked around, and a few people chuckled. He continued with the ceremony. I lifted Amy's veil, and we shared a kiss while everyone cheered, even those who had just witnessed the earlier drama. Darren then stood up, letting everyone know that due to a delay, everyone laughed. We would start taking pictures on the beach right away, and then we would come back and greet everyone as Mr. and Mrs. Other. It took about half an hour for the photos. The pictures turned out amazing. The photographer was really good, but there were also some very sad shots. While we were on the beach, smiling and laughing, he captured a few moments of joy. But in the background, far down the beach, my family looked sad and lost. Over the years, Amy and I would look at that photo and feel sorrow. It was a sad time. We spent our honeymoon in Greece, where we enjoyed exploring the sights and eating so much food. We met the locals during the day, had dinner as the sun set, and shared lovely moments until early morning. Once we got home, it was back to work. Alro Homes was growing quickly, and many people wanted our high-end products. One surprising area was farmers asking for single-container homes for their land, replacing the old shearers' quarters. After a few requests, I asked our team to design an outback range for the tough Australian outback, with its red dust and the lifestyle of farm workers. In that first year, once news got out, we sold more of those homes than any others. As the CEO of Alro, Amy was always busy, but she only needed to see me to change her schedule and spend a few hours together. After the first few months of our marriage, she would often come and interrupt my work instead of me interrupting her. Our first fight was about something we really disagreed on, a prenuptial agreement. George had prepared the paper after I asked a few times, but Amy kept canceling it. We argued hard one evening, both of us saying things we didn't mean. In short, Amy didn't want a prenuptial agreement. I admired her for that, but I knew she needed legal protection for Alro. She shouted at me. "Do you know what the company name means?" Amy's voice got really loud. "It means there isn't going to be any agreement. What's mine is yours, and that's it." I replied that I understood, but she still needed protection. The argument became worse. At one point, Amy hinted that she now understood how my family felt about me being so stubborn that I couldn't see reason. We both knew she didn't mean it when she said that, but the words were out. For a moment, we were both quiet, unsure of what to say. I looked at her, hurt by her words, even though I knew she didn't truly mean them. A little later, I left Amy, who was in tears. For 2 hours, I locked myself in the gym and worked out hard until my knuckles were bleeding. I didn't wrap them before using the punching bag, and I pushed myself so hard that I finally passed out. I woke up on the gym floor with my head in Amy's lap, her tears soaking my shirt. "Robbie, oh Robbie, my love, I'm so sorry. Hang in there, an ambulance is coming." At that moment, she looked at me and saw I was awake. "Robbie, Robbie." She kept whispering, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry," over and over again. They took me to the hospital, checked me quickly, then sent me home. I was really emotional. I'd been working too hard at Alro Homes and just needed some time outside. "I'll sign the agreement, sweetie," Amy said as we cuddled in bed later that evening. I regret what I said. It was wrong, and I feel terrible. I kissed her head as she leaned against my chest, still softly crying. It's okay, Amy. I know you didn't mean it, I told her. I guess I'm not as perfect in your eyes now. I feel not good, she said. Shh, you're just as human as the rest of us, I know that. You were right, too. I can be stubborn sometimes. We just had our first real fight, that's all. I held my wife close. Amy, you should know that the agreement doesn't bother me. What's mine is yours, and what's yours is mine for our whole life. I just want to keep anyone from bothering us if they ever ask. I married you, not your money. I know, dear, Amy replied as she snuggled against me. It just feels like I was being unfaithful by signing it. After talking a bit more, and as Amy rested against me, I started to feel a connection grow. It wasn't long before we shared an intimate moment, the moonlight shining in and showing her soft features and everything I loved about her. Afterward, we both felt calm, finding peace after our emotional argument. The next week, Amy had to take an unexpected 3-day trip to New Zealand. A studio wanted to film a new fantasy series in the New Zealand wilderness. ALRO was an important investor in one of the companies the studio was working with, so Amy needed to go to some meetings about the project. Amy found it harder to be away than I did that first night. She called me from her hotel later, and we spent hours talking, just like we did at home. We had some fun playing around on video chat. It was a bit silly, but we enjoyed it. The next night, we didn't get to talk much because she was having dinner with the production team, but I sent her a text before bed saying I loved her and would see her at home the next day. In the morning, I went to ALRO Homes, spending most of the day with our teams to make sure we were on schedule. I had meetings and worked with the admin team to look over our finances. We were set to make a good profit this quarter. We thought it would be 10% more than we expected, so I felt good about it. When I got home, though, I started to feel worried. Amy was not home, even though she should have returned hours ago. I tried calling her phone, but I only got her voicemail. Over the next hour, I called her from different devices and apps. I even reached out to Maria, the manager at ALRO in New Zealand. She hadn't seen Amy since last night at a dinner with clients. Maria sounded a little unsure when I spoke to her for the third time, still without any news about Amy. Maria, what's going on? What are you not telling me? I asked. Nothing, Robbie. It's nothing, she replied, but it didn't sound true. I looked out the window as the sun set over the ocean and my worry grew. Where was Amy? Come on, Maria. My wife is missing and you aren't being honest. Please tell me what's happening before I contact the police, I said, my voice getting tense. There was a long silence on the line. I could almost feel the weight of it. Then I heard Maria let out a sigh. I'm not sure how comfortable I feel talking about this, she started. Last night we went out with the studio team, the production company, and a few others. Yes, I know. Amy told me, I said quickly. Well, Amy had a few drinks, and there was this guy, Kurt, who was a production manager. He got a bit cozy with Amy, Maria explained. I held my breath, trying not to let my mind race with thoughts. I started pacing in our living room. Maria, I said, searching for the right questions. I don't know, Robbie, Maria continued. It was like she was trying to answer my unasked questions. Amy didn't seem like herself most of the night. When she got up to leave, Kurt followed her. I didn't see or hear from either of them after that. We were both quiet for a moment. I'm sorry, Maria said softly. We talked for a few more minutes. Maria said she would check with several people but hadn't heard anything yet. She hadn't gone to the authorities, but she would if she didn't find out anything in the next few hours. I could tell she was worried. Maria had come to our wedding a few months ago and understood how hard this was for me, especially after the argument with Amy's sister. After I hung up, I nearly collapsed onto the couch, staring at the balcony. I felt like screaming. I wanted to cry. I tried to think of different reasons why Amy wasn't talking to me or why she had left with Kurt, both of them out of reach for almost 24 hours. I called Peter and Rain, and then Darren and Tony to see if they had heard from Amy, but none of them had. I called the hotel and they told me Amy had checked out, but they couldn't give me any more information. I tried everything I could think of, but I couldn't find my wife. I was on hold with the New Zealand police when I saw car lights move across the glass in the front door. Someone was driving into the driveway. In a flash, I was outside. Very timidly, Amy was getting out of the car with the help of the driver. I rushed to her side. As soon as she felt my touch, she melted into my arms and started crying. The driver got Amy's bag from the trunk and looked at me. He gave me a sad smile, but I waved him away before he could say anything. Amy clung to me as I took her inside. I sat her down on the couch and handed her a box of tissues. She sobbed, holding me close, never looking into my eyes. I could feel her fear, and I didn't know how to help her. Inside, while I held her, my heart broke a little more. My love for Amy was much stronger than what I felt for Georgia long ago. But in that moment, I feared I would be hurt again. I didn't know if I had the strength to face another betrayal. Yet I knew that my love for the woman in my arms was just as strong, if not stronger, than it had been before she left. I decided then that even if something bad had happened, I would forgive her no matter how hard it felt. If my heart had to break to keep Amy happy, I was ready for that. We had not said a word yet. Amy held me tightly. I felt her shake a little, but her hands stayed wrapped around me as if she feared I might disappear. Minutes went by and I took a breath. "Amy?" I said, looking down at her. She looked up at me. Her face was tear-streaked and her long black hair was sticking to her cheeks. Tears had soaked her shirt and her eyes had bright red circles around them. "Robbie, I'm—" she started, but then she broke down again into tears. I let her cry for a few more minutes before I leaned forward and handed her some tissues. "Shh, my love, here," I said gently. She briefly glanced at me, then at the tissues in my hand. That's when I saw the scratches on her arm. They looked red and painful, just starting to scab. When she blew her nose, she noticed my frown and followed my eyes. "Amy, what happened?" I asked softly. For a few minutes, she didn't say anything, but at least she wasn't crying anymore. "Robbie, I am so sorry," were the first words I finally heard from her. "Sorry? Amy, are you all right?" Panic began to rise inside me, but not from feeling betrayed. She shook her head and whispered, "No." I wanted to hold her, but I felt scared. My heart raced. I could almost hear it pounding in my ears. What had happened? Was she still my wife? Had she betrayed my trust, or was there something even worse going on? "Robbie, I don't want to lose you, but can you please get me some water?" "I need a moment to collect my thoughts," Amy asked, struggling with feelings I couldn't quite grasp. I hesitated, then stood up, went to the kitchen, filled 2 glasses with water, and came back to the couch. "Thank you," she said softly, trying to stay calm. She took a sip, swallowed, looked down at her arm for a moment, and then back at me. "Robbie, this is going to be difficult." She spoke quietly. "You might not like me after I tell you this, but I promise I have always been honest with you." I swallowed hard, feeling a knot in my stomach. Amy locked eyes with me for the first time since she returned home. I could see she was preparing to share something heavy. "Last night, Maria and I went to dinner and drinks with the production team after some successful meetings." I nodded, already knowing this. "The dinner was nice, but I really missed you. While I was getting ready, I wanted to call you to hear your voice and maybe joke around a bit. I had been thinking about us all day after the fun we had the night before." She flushed slightly. I stayed quiet, my heart racing, knowing she was about to tell me something I wouldn't like. As we started eating, I began to feel unwell. I was drinking some wine. Amy raised her hand. "I know it's not my usual drink, but everyone else was, so I thought 2 glasses would be okay." She briefly met my eyes before looking down at her lap. One of the production managers, Kurt, was flirting with me throughout dinner. I didn't encourage it, but he was persistent. I think Maria noticed, but she didn't say anything unless I asked for help. Amy kept speaking softly. "After dinner, I felt really bad. I finished my wine, told everyone I wasn't well, and since I had an early flight, I said my goodbyes. I didn't notice anyone else leave until I realized Kurt had followed me to say goodbye. I didn't think much of it since we were all at the same hotel. Once we got into the elevator, I felt even worse. Then, without asking, Kurt helped me back to my room. As soon as I opened the door, I ran straight for the bathroom. I barely made it before I got sick. I sat there feeling uneasy about where this was going. Amy noticed my expression, squeezed my hand, and continued to talk. I must have sat there for 5 minutes before I felt Kurt's hand rubbing my back. At first it felt nice, but then I remembered you weren't there, and a stranger was in my hotel room. Trying not to show my discomfort, I got up, washed my hands with Kurt watching, and walked back into the main room. I thanked Kurt for bringing me back to my room and hinted that he should leave. He kept asking if I was okay and then gave me a clearly open water bottle. Amy struggled to tell me this, but when our eyes met, I felt a spark of hope that Amy was still with me. I felt something was off about what just happened, so I set the bottle on the bedside table and tried to push him out of my room. He still didn't get the message, so I asked him to leave because I felt uneasy. He turned to the door, but instead of leaving, he kicked the door and pulled it shut. As I listened, my wife explained how Kurt's attitude changed. He locked the door and then came toward her. This rude Kurt said he wanted her to be with him and that she belonged to him now. He had wanted her since the first moment he saw her. Now that they were alone, he would take her and she would be his. My anger grew as Amy told me how she screamed and fought back against Kurt when he tried to trap her. Kurt was strong and fit. She mentioned how he hit her once and laughed, but then he yelled out in pain when she used one of the self-defense moves I had taught her to stomp on his foot and then his groin. She quickly ran for the door when he fell, calling for help. Amy managed to unlock the door, but just as she reached for it, Kurt grabbed her and threw her back inside. She told me that she hit her arm on the edge of the desk, which caused the scratches I saw. Kurt was furious and came at Amy again, ignoring his pain. But my wife wasn't going to back down. When Kurt tried to pin her down, she rolled out of the way. Amy got up quickly and kicked him again, first in the groin and then in the head. Kurt was hurting now, and she prepared for another kick when the door swung open. 3 big security guards rushed into the room after someone heard her screaming, just as Amy kicked Kurt again. In the middle of the chaos, the security had to hold Amy back, who was furious. Kurt, knocked out from her last kick, was taken to the hospital while Amy was arrested. She was detained for several hours without proper rights, trying to make her anxious. Since Amy was from Australia, they wouldn't let her call George or me because it was a long-distance call. Her phone had broken in the fight, and she didn't even have Maria's number. The police didn't care who Amy was or who Kurt was. They only saw her hurting a man who was not awake. When Amy got a lawyer in the early morning, she spent hours trying to explain to the young lawyer that she was protecting herself from someone who wanted to harm her. But it wasn't until almost mid-morning that the police started to believe her. Kurt had woken up in the hospital and told a story saying Amy had come on to him during dinner and asked him to her hotel room. When he turned her down, he said she got violent. The police didn't trust him, but he claimed there was no way a small woman could fight a big man like him unless she surprised him. The police had 2 differing accounts, one from a man in the hospital and another from a woman from Australia who, to them, seemed to be at fault. Things changed when Amy got sick again. The police brought her water and a snack, but soon after she was throwing it all up. A doctor came in, took some blood, asked her more questions, and soon they began to think she might have been harmed. This time, when she shared her story, they listened. The police found Amy in the bathroom, sick with water and some blood from her arm on the desk. She laughed when they asked how she could defend herself against someone like Kurt. "My husband is Robbie Other, the MMA fighter who beat Cody McGuinness." One officer recognized the name. Once they realized she was the victim, everything started to turn in her favor. Quickly, her lawyer made sure Amy was free to go and arranged for her to head straight to the airport. No one could reach me because the caller had dialed one number wrong. So, scared and alone, Amy hired a plane to take her home, promising to return for the court case. Just before boarding the flight, the police gave her a report. Kurt had been arrested for attacking her and for other serious charges. The test results they gave Amy showed she hadn't taken any drugs, but that she could have been in danger if she had drunk the water, which Kurt had mixed with harmful substances. "So why were you so sick, Amy? If he didn't drug you, was it something you ate?" I asked. "That's the thing, baby. It wasn't drugs or food poisoning," she replied, still a bit upset from sharing the story. "They told me I'd been throwing up because I'm pregnant." I sat there, shocked for a moment, trying to take it all in. In just one day, my feelings had flipped from worry to panic, thinking my life was falling apart because I had worried that Amy might not be faithful to me. I was worried about someone hurting her. Then I heard my wife was going to have a baby. I must have taken too long to react. "Robbie, did you hear me? You're going to be a father," she said, looking at me with worry. "I'm going to be a dad?" I whispered, staring at my wife. She gave me a concerned look. "Robbie." "Oh no, Robbie," Amy said, her eyes full of fear. "There's no way that this... Robbie." She reached out to me, tears in her eyes, thinking about what I might be feeling. I wrapped my arms around her. "Shh," I said. "I know, my love, and I'm sorry I thought that. It's not right to you." She cried for a moment, then hit my chest softly. "No, it's not fair, and I will always blame Georgia for doing this to you." She paused and looked up at me. "But I want you to know, there has never been another man but you. This baby is yours." That night we fell asleep holding each other, saying how much we loved one another. I kept rubbing her belly, and we drifted off feeling exhausted. In the morning we shared a close moment, then called her parents and reached out to Darren and Tony to tell them Amy was home and safe. We also called George and shared a shorter version of what had happened. By the end of the day, he was starting legal action against the production house and Kurt, sending 3 of his team to New Zealand to handle the situation. "No more last-minute trips without me, all right, honey?" I said during dinner that night. "I'm not going to be traveling anymore," she replied, holding her belly and smiling at me. "Soon I'll be as big as a barn." "And what a beautiful barn you will be," I answered, getting a playful punch in the arm from her. As the months went by, we were busy. The production house quickly let go of Kurt, giving Aelro and Amy good terms to settle. Kurt got out on bail with one of those electronic tracking devices. We heard he got hurt a few months later, but no one knew who did it. Amy's belly grew larger, and I enjoyed rubbing it every evening. Amy was busy with Aelro, but I made sure her managers took on more of her work as her due date got closer. Her clients and the team worldwide knew she wouldn't be traveling for a while, so everyone planned to come visit her in Australia for the next year instead of meeting through video calls. LRO Homes was also expanding. With help and support from Aelro, we added 2 more teams. I was surprised to see we often competed with my old job, Total Build. It felt good that we won 3 out of 4 projects against them. In some ways, it made me feel good that I was on the right path. The feelings of unworthiness that my family had tried to put on me were not true. With many changes happening fast in our lives, Amy asked Rain and Peter to sign agreements to keep things private a few months before the baby was born. They were very surprised to learn that their daughter was now a multimillionaire. They promised to keep quiet about it, and that included Amy's pregnancy from Georgia and my family. One warm August morning, as winter was ending, Amy went into labor. After an exhausting 19 hours, my incredible wife gave birth to our son. William Other was born, and I felt a pride like never before. Amy was tired but happy to be a mom, and I was so proud of her. Over the next few weeks, we got used to being parents, even though sleep was hard to find. Newborns sure know how to keep you awake. Darren and Tony became William's godparents. Then, unexpectedly, they decided to move to the Sunshine Coast to be closer to us. They surprised us again by announcing their engagement. That weekend, we had a barbecue at our place with Amy's parents, Darren and Tony, while Amy took care of William. It felt nice to have a normal day with family and friends around. I found myself smiling a lot that afternoon. About 3 months later, I was at work when Cameron, one of our salespeople, came into my office. "Hey, boss, what's up?" he said as he sat down on the chair across from me. I took a sip of my coffee, trying to fight off the sleepiness from being up all night. I looked at Cameron, who just chuckled. "Don't worry, it gets easier," he said, noticing how tired I looked as a new dad. "Does it?" I asked, hoping it was true. In the past week, I'd been up with William until 3 in the morning, giving Amy time to rest. She was very tired from breastfeeding, taking care of our son, and still keeping up with things at Aelro. I was helping whenever I could, changing diapers without a worry. But Amy was in charge of baby care, and I knew better than to take over, so I let her sleep whenever possible. "Not really," he chuckled. "But don't regret any of it, boss. You'll remember both the good and the bad as they grow up, and you'll learn to laugh about it." Cameron had 3 kids with his high school sweetheart. "What do you need today, Cam?" I asked, shifting the conversation and taking another sip of coffee to wake myself up. I've got something interesting, boss. You remember how we've been doing well in the camping space with those modern container products? Yes, it's going great. Do you have another new client? I asked, hoping for more good news. Cameron shook his head. No, one of the salespeople from a company we've been competing with reached out to me yesterday. I raised an eyebrow, sensing something was up. I knew. Cameron noticed it, but I don't think he really understood. Go on, I told him. Well, he called me up acting like he was the best thing since sliced bread, Cameron said, looking a bit annoyed as he remembered the conversation. He was trying to convince me that his product was amazing, but since we've been beating them in sales lately, we should team up with them. I scoffed. I already knew who the salesperson was, but I let Cameron keep talking. To be honest, Robbie, the guy was a real jerk, but I remembered what you always say about finding chances in every problem. So, I invited him to meet you for coffee in 2 weeks. I don't think anything will come of it, but who knows? Maybe they can help us sell our products. Cameron laughed, but I frowned. He looked at me while I thought for a moment. I stood up and walked around the room, then turned back to him. Cancel the meeting. I'm not interested, I said. Boss? Cameron looked surprised. Just to be clear, you mean Brad Other Jr. from Total Build, right? I asked. Yeah, how did you... Oh, no, it's them, isn't it? I nodded, and I nodded again. I hadn't shared my background with anyone, but the industry is small and some rumors had circulated. Plus, it was tough to hide the last name Other since that linked me to Total Build. Consider the meeting canceled. I'll call right now, Cameron said, getting up from his chair. Thanks, Cam, I sighed. He paused at the door and said, Don't worry about it, boss. I should have figured it out. I'm sorry if I brought back bad memories. I waved him off. It's fine. Keep looking for chances. I appreciate your creativity, but there's no way I'm working with that company or my difficult older brother again. We chatted for a few more minutes before Cameron left. He returned about half an hour later to tell me he had canceled the meeting and hadn't mentioned my name. He said Brad was upset, trying everything to keep the meeting, even promising to bring my dad, the CEO of Total Build, which Cameron politely refused. I thought that would be the end of it, but with my family, I should have known better. It was a Wednesday morning 2 weeks later. Amy and I walked into ALRO Homes for a few hours, coffee in hand, and I was carrying a happy little William when my past reappeared in front of me. Now I know why I couldn't get a meeting. That guy works here, I heard my older brother's arrogant voice say. We turned back to the waiting area, realizing we had missed the group sitting on the sofas. My dad, Brad Jr., and Georgia were there. Georgia had a baby in a stroller and a toddler, who I guessed was my first nephew, sitting on her lap. Her eyes moved from Amy to William and then to me. When our eyes met, I saw a look of sadness on her face as she watched me hold my son. My older brother Brad just glared at me after he spoke first. I see you haven't changed much, I replied. You're still a big disappointment. But yes, you are right. I am the reason you missed your meeting. Brad took a breath, ready to fire back, but our father raised his hand to stop him. I knew he was going to say something sharp. Robert, when Brad's meeting got canceled, we decided to come and meet with Cameron and your boss. ALRO Homes has taken a bigger share of our market recently, and we wanted to see if we could work together. Now that I see you, he continued, his voice turning a bit harsh, I have to ask, are you really so small-minded as to hurt our already struggling business? Even though I dislike my father and everything he has done to me, I had to admit he was trying to act professionally. That must have taken a lot of self-control. I could see he was reassessing the meeting he thought he could have. He had tried to rekindle some connections since I moved on. I sighed. No. Even with everything you've done to me, calling me your enemy and suing me for no good reason, I have not tried to take work from Total Build. After winning most of those bids, I was surprised to learn that we were up against you. But you're still stealing jobs from us, shouted Brad Jr. I chuckled. William, still in my arms, looked up at me, smiling when he heard me laugh. Without saying anything, I handed William to Amy, who had been watching us. I leaned in, kissed her, and quietly asked her to take him into the office and away from this mess. She kissed me back, smiled, and then glanced at her sister before walking away with our son on her hip. As she passed by the receptionist, she gave her a look. The receptionist followed Amy, leaving me with my family and ex-wife. "So, what do you want?" I asked my father, crossing my arms. He studied my face, and his attitude shifted now that we were alone. "I want to talk to your boss, the owner of Alro Homes. I want to tell him that my dishonest son is taking our clients. I want to let him know that you're ashamed to this field and that you have no connection to us. I will explain to him that if he lets you go and works with us instead, we will make much more money together than he ever would with you. When I meet with him, I will show him that you mean nothing. I see you, along with your wife and son, are struggling like I said you would." I raised my eyebrows and smirked. I wondered if he was losing his grip on reality as he got older and things didn't go his way. He took a breath and continued. "You think you have control here, but you don't. I have more experience than you. You may think this business is doing well, but when I speak with your boss, I will show them that my experience and my team can do much better than anything you offer." My father smiled, but it seemed more like he was holding on to a thin thread of sanity. "When I meet with them, they will see that you learned everything from me. I can do it better, faster, and for more money than you. I will see you fail and kicked out of here. Alro Homes will turn away from you, and you will beg me for any help I can give you." He spoke with a passion that felt almost desperate. His strong dislike for me clouded his judgment. "So," I asked, "if that's your plan, why do you think I would let you talk to the owner of Alro Homes?" I took a satisfied sip of my coffee. "You have no choice," my father replied with a smile. "Now that I know you're here, I will start working against you. I will break you down piece by piece. I will meet with them and make sure they know who you really are." I couldn't help but laugh at him. "So you're willing to lie and create problems. Do you really dislike me that much because I refused to go along with what you wanted? By the way, is that my niece in that stroller, or does it belong to Chris?" I smirked. No one answered, which made me realize she wasn't my relative. "It doesn't matter," my father shot back. "Brad is raising Colleen, which is what you should have done." I looked at them all and felt a little sorry for my older brother for the first time. He was raising another man's child, and Brad Jr. and Georgia looked embarrassed as they listened to our argument. I laughed again, but raised my hand when they seemed ready to react. "Sorry, but I find this whole situation funny. Because of that, I'll let you meet the owners for a few minutes," I told my father. "I doubt you'll convince them with your obvious lies, but it should at least be entertaining. Just give me a moment to set it up." They seemed surprised, but without saying anything else, I turned and walked into the back office while they sat back down, whispering. I don't think they expected me to give in to what they wanted. Right inside the door, Amy was sitting in a chair, feeding William and chatting with Jenny, who works at the front desk. "I've told everyone to come in through the warehouse door this morning while—" Jenny looked at Amy and then back at me, pausing for a moment. "While your family is in the reception area." "It's all fine, Jenny," I said, smiling at my wife. "I told them they could meet with the owners of Alro Homes. I said they could try to convince me why I should be let go for not doing my job right and why Alro Homes should team up with Total Build because of their experience." Amy gave me a funny look for a second, then smiled. "You're enjoying this, aren't you?" she asked. "Yep." I returned her smile. "Robbie, you know if we do this, your family and even Georgia might start to figure out what's going on with us?" she said with a frown. I sighed. "Yeah, Brad wouldn't, but Dad might. Are you worried that people will find out who owns Alro?" Amy paused for a moment, thinking. She adjusted her shawl, cradling William, and gently got him to burp. She shook her head. "Now that we're married and have William, not as much as I used to. Even if your dad puts two and two together about Alro, he might just think I work here and used my connections to help us." "Maybe," I said. "So how about we ask Cameron to introduce us?" "Good idea," my wife replied with a grin. Just a few minutes later, Cameron came out, greeting my father, my brother, and Georgia. Moments later, Amy and I walked out holding hands, and the three visitors looked surprised. "Everyone," Cameron said, "I'd like to introduce you to the owners of Alro Homes, Robbie and Amy Other. They are some of the best business owners I know and very smart people." "Wow!" Brad exclaimed, looking at us with wide eyes. "You own this place? How? It must be worth millions. Amy spoke in a very formal way. This facility is worth around $2.5 million. Our other site is worth a little over $3 million. In our first year, Alro Homes has made more than $15 million with an 8% profit. As you know, our products are becoming known for their high quality. Thanks to our CEO, we always meet our deadlines, and our investors are pleased with how quickly Alro is growing. Investors? Brad Jr. asked. Yes, investors, I replied. Alro Homes has outside investment, and our investment team eagerly helped us once we had our business plan ready. They still guide us in our growth today, helping us make important connections. Right now, we are planning to grow a lot in the next few years. This means we will have new products, enter new markets, and make our products stand out as the best in the world. We aim to do this better than anything Total Build can offer. My brother just stared at me. Georgia was busy trying to keep her son entertained, but my dad looked very upset. "You little brat!" my father suddenly shouted. "Do you think you're so clever because you own this place? Are you really so good that you can hurt this family? Well, I hope you shove your little business where the sun doesn't shine. Do you really think we've just let this go? I will ruin you." "Seriously, Dad," I said, using the title I hadn't called him in years. He seemed to forget I used to say that. "Look, for so many years you've yelled and complained. You want me to live my life under your control. You've repeatedly threatened to ruin me, wasting your time and money." He was about to answer, but I cut him off, tired of his words. "Shut up, old man," I said sharply, making everyone turn to me. "Did I take Total Build's market share? Yes. Your threats don't mean anything to me. With every threat you make, I respond before you even get started, but I won't tell you how. You'll never see what's coming. You once said I should have accepted being betrayed by someone who's not very bright." I shot back, looking at my older brother. He didn't seem to understand. I figured he was still trying to grasp the idea that I was now a CEO. I kept pushing against my father, our eyes locked in a stare as I continued. "You told me to accept a lousy wife who got pregnant with my brother's child while we were married, and she also had a baby with her sister-in-law's fiancé after a party. Can you please put aside your anger for just a moment? Can you try to see things from the outside? Get over yourself and realize that to outsiders, it looks like a big, messy drama in this family. And while you pretend to be hurt by my actions, you now have less than 20% of the market you used to have. You've had to move 3 times in 2 years just to stay afloat. Any good builder in the Gold Coast stays away from you because they don't know if they will get paid. I also know you're on your last warning to keep your Bunnings trade account in line, or you'll lose access to those supplies." My father's eyes widened in shock. "Yes, Dad," I stressed. "I'm not as clueless as your other son. I've kept an eye on Total Build since my departure. I worked really hard on this place, and even though I have mixed feelings about all of you, it hurts to see it in such bad shape." "Shut up, loser," my brother snapped back. "We would have been fine if you hadn't taken our work." I chuckled. "Brad, you need to look in a mirror. You're calling me a loser?" I shook my head. My brother was raising another man's child as his own, yet he wanted to call me a loser when I walked away from the same situation with the same woman. I glanced at Georgia, who was trying to stay out of sight while playing with her son and gently rocking her daughter in her stroller. I felt I had to show them that I knew more than they thought. But even before we started Alro Homes, your sales had dropped by over 13%. I can only guess that any deals you made are thanks to our dad's experience and not your ability to sell. How many of those deals did I fix before I left? We all stared at each other in silence for a moment. Dad regained some of his confidence. "Listen, Robert, I want you to stop interfering. Leave our business alone. I came here thinking we might partner, but knowing you own this place, I now see I could never work with someone like you. Now it's on. You're my biggest problem. I'll make sure this place falls apart, you lose everything, and your kids will never forgive you." I shook my head. He still didn't get it. He stood up to leave, but he had one last jab for me. "You could have avoided all of this, Robert. You could have been happy. You could have had Georgia and your own kids by now. But instead, I will make sure you suffer." He clearly didn't see me and Amy walking in happily with William. "I guess," I started to say, but Amy raised her hand. "Listen, Brad," my wife said, breaking her silence. "You just threatened us again. You have made promises over and over, but look around. You can see what Alro Homes has become. You must have some idea of our support. We are 3 times bigger than Total Build was at its peak, and that was when my husband worked for you, making things easy for you. You really need to wake up. This is the second time I've heard you threaten us like this. You're already breaking a restraining order. And just so you know, our security cameras have recorded everything, and we will send it to our lawyer. I think you remember George. My father looked surprised for a moment as he recalled his last run-in with George. He lost badly. The case was thrown out before my father could even speak. Amy continued, her tone turning serious as the CEO of Alro. I'm sorry, but I can't assist with that. For that alone, I will always carry a heavy burden. But then I got involved with your sister's fiancé. It didn't really matter that I had her blessing at the time. The fact that I ended up pregnant by him is all she needs to dislike me. I realized then that Georgia was hurting. She looked into my eyes, sadness written all over her face. And look at you, she said, trying to change the subject. You're a successful business owner and doing better than your family's company ever did. You married a wonderful woman, she added softly. She paused, noticing I was ready to reply. Yes, Robbie, I know Amy. She had a crush on you from the moment we started dating. She never looked at anyone else, so it doesn't surprise me you're with her. I can see how that would happen after I pushed you away. Tears began to fall from her eyes, but I just stood there. She didn't ask for help, nor did I offer it. And now you have your son, Georgia said, something that I kept from you. But if it helps at all, watching you with him this morning felt like a knife in my stomach. I know that should have been me sharing that moment with you, but I was too selfish, thinking of myself. Georgia wiped her eyes, and there was a long, quiet moment before she continued, picking up the diaper bag and hanging it over the stroller. Robbie, I'm not happy. The only reason I haven't done anything drastic is my kids. She gave me a small smile. I'm unhappy except when I'm with them and living in a kind of hell, feeling mistreated by everyone. If that gives you any comfort, then I gladly share that as a way to make up for what we did to you. Georgia, I began, touched by her apparent regret. No, Robbie, she interrupted, raising her hand. I don't want your pity. I just want you to know. Your family means nothing without you. I am nothing without you. She whispered the last part. Don't let your father get away with anything. Despite what Amy said, I worry that their hatred for you will cloud their judgment. She started pushing the stroller toward the door and paused when the sliding door opened for her, looking back at me. Robbie, you are the kindest person I have ever met. You are smart, hardworking, and honest. My sister is the luckiest woman in the world. She looked deeply at me. Take care of her, Robbie. She may not like me, but I still care for her almost as much as I still care for you. Then Georgia walked out of my life again. I stood there for a while before I felt Amy's arms wrap around me. She's right. I am the luckiest woman in the world. I turned to kiss my wife, and I am the luckiest man. In the months that followed, we heard a few rumors about our product, and suddenly Total Build was competing for every job we were after. George quickly shut down the rumors because we knew where they were coming from. In response to Total Build's bid for our work, I made sure that Alro Homes carefully considered every project that could compete with them. If there was a good profit to be made, we went for it. If not, we let them have the leftover opportunities. Amy took her first trip abroad since the incident in New Zealand and the birth of our son, William. He was mostly finished nursing, so I was giving him the breast milk that Amy had saved for us. The night before she left, Amy and I shared a lovely evening together, falling asleep in each other's arms. William and I saw her off at the airport, and I made sure her security was set while she traveled. I felt anxious those first few days, and I think Amy did too. But she returned home 10 days later, and we were both very relieved. Amy told me she felt nervous when people approached her at dinner, but she was glad to have security with her. We spent a lot of time together, and I must say I enjoyed the moments we shared. After some sweet exchanges, we decided to try for another child. In early May, we found out that we would be parents again. We were both very excited, but Amy was more emotional this time and had big mood swings. One evening, she came with Darren, Tony, and me to one of my unsanctioned fights. After the match, She was very upset with my opponent for a move he made and got a bit angry with me for not taking care of myself enough. Later, after Tony helped calm her down, she apologized to me. A little after the 6-month mark of her pregnancy, Darren and I had an overnight training camp for a fight I was preparing for in June. It was another sanctioned fight, and Amy, along with Darren and Tony, encouraged me to go for it. She was trying to make up for her earlier emotional outburst. I kissed Amy as I left with Darren for our 6-hour drive to northern New South Wales. Tony and Amy planned to spend time together since they were both expecting. Yes, Darren and Tony were having a baby too. They waited until after the first trimester to share the news. Tony felt her time was running out, so they decided to try for a child. They were fortunate to conceive naturally despite some health issues Tony had in her late teens. Darren was very happy, but like my wife, Tony's emotions were quite mixed. We cared about our girls deeply, but taking a few days away for training was just what we needed. When we got to the camp, there were 12 of us ready for 2 days of hard work. They had us exercising non-stop with weights, running, and stretching. It was tough, and if you weren't already in shape, it would be very hard. When we finally got home, we were tired but happy. I was looking forward to a relaxing evening with my girls, maybe sharing a drink, cuddling, and enjoying some quality time with my wife. But that's not what awaited us. "Ladies, we're back!" I said cheerfully as Darren and I walked through the door. "What are you doing here? Get out!" my wife screamed at me. "Amy, wait! What's going on?" I tried to respond, but she wouldn't let me. "Don't you Amy me, you lying cheater! How could you do this to me?" she yelled through her tears. Tony stood behind her, arms crossed over her pregnant belly. I was stunned. Amy had never talked to me like this before. Sure, we had arguments, but we always figured things out. "Amy, I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to understand. "Robbie, I thought I knew you all these years. How could you do this?" Tony added angrily, her voice sharp. "Tony, Amy, what's going on? What happened?" I asked, looking at Darren, but he looked just as confused as I was. "You betrayed me with her. That's what you did." Amy's voice was now filled with sadness. "What? I did what? Who?" I stammered, feeling completely lost. "Tony, can you please explain what's happening?" Darren asked. "Robbie and I were at camp for the past 2 days. It was only guys there. Nothing like that happened." "Darren, stay out of this," Tony said, her eyes focused on me. "If you helped Robbie in any way, you won't get any sympathy from me." Now I was getting angry. I was being accused of something I didn't do by 2 people who should trust me. "Tony, Amy, tell me right now what's going on," I demanded. I think my tone made Tony realize something, and her anger softened a bit. "Are you involved with Georgia?" she asked, her eyes searching mine. "What?" I shouted. "Why would I be with my ex-wife? You all know I can't stand her." "Then how can you explain this?" Tony said as Amy continued to look at me in distress. Tony walked over and grabbed Amy's phone. Amy looked at me in despair as she unlocked it. Tony opened an email from a sender labeled Concerned Observer. The email read, "Dear Amy, I regret having to tell you this, but Robert is having an affair with your sister, Georgia." The weight of the email hung heavy in the room. I felt the ground shift beneath me as I tried to process what was happening. "This has been happening since they came to visit you months ago. I understand you might not believe me, but they have been meeting regularly. Please see the attached photos and videos as proof. Yours sincerely, a concerned citizen." Attached to the email were several photos and a couple of short videos. In those pictures, you could see Georgia in her underwear posing. Some of the photos showed a close-up of me with her. The short video showed me with Georgia in a way that looked intimate, and she was enjoying it. The last picture showed Georgia and me smiling at the camera. "Amy, it's not what it looks like, right, dear husband?" Amy snapped. "Look, Amy, I can explain," I tried to say. Amy was upset and wasn't listening to me. She was only focusing on the old stories of cheaters, not knowing the real story was deeper. "Is that you in those photos?" she asked through gritted teeth. "Yes, it is, but—" I attempted to explain. "Get out!" she yelled. "Get out!" She began to cry hard. "Amy!" I called out, but she fell to the ground. "How could you, Robbie, after everything they put you through? How could you do this to Amy?" Tony said as Amy continued to cry. "Tony, it's not what it looks like." I looked at Darren. He looked confused, caught between the photos and wanting to support me. It's not, I swear. I was feeling terrible, sounding just like someone who had cheated, even though I hadn't. Just go. Leave, Robbie, Amy sobbed. The secrets are out, but the story is far from over. As the dust settles from one betrayal, new challenges emerge, threatening to tear everything apart once more. What will happen next? Stay tuned for part 2, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss how this gripping tale unfolds.